Hi, everyone. Welcome today to this webinar presentation. This is being sponsored by the Global CCS Institute, the U.S. Energy Association, and the Department of Energy Office of Fossil Energy. We're really excited to have a great group of panelists to talk specifically about developing projects in Texas. This is the first of a series of 3 events we're hosting with these 3 organizations, USEA and DOE, focused on regionally how we can best explore moving forward on CCS projects given the finalization of 45Q earlier this year. We will also be having events focused on Louisiana and then the Colorado-Wyoming region. All of these events were obviously planned in person, but they have gone virtually given COVID-19. And I'd certainly like to express on behalf of all the organizations that we hope everyone in the CCS community is safe and their families are safe and well. Moving on to the next slide, let me give you a little bit of information about the GoToWebinar system. If you haven't used it previously, you do have the ability to customize your screen. There's a control panel on top where you can choose to see the presenters via webcam. You can choose to see only the one who's speaking or all of the panelists in certain cases, or you can just choose to see the slides. So you have the ability to customize that on top and also to take screenshots. Certainly feel free to share those via social media and continue to promote the importance of CCS as a climate mitigation tool. Going on to the next slide. With the GoToWebinar, you won't be able to unmute to come off to ask questions. So if you do have questions throughout this first day of sessions, certainly put them into the question box. Now, for the first couple sessions we have with both Leslie Savage and Jeff Erickson, I will not be taking questions on those. They're very short sessions. But if you do have sessions, we can certainly pass them along. And then for the later panel discussions, I'll be moderating those with questions, as well as Keith Tracy's panel on 45Q. But that's where you put questions if you have them. Going to the next slide. Just a brief introduction on who the Global CCS Institute is, if you don't know who we are, and again, who I am. My name is Patricia Loria. I'm the Senior Client Engagement Lead for North America here out of the Global CCS Institute. I usually work in the DC office, but I'm at home in Virginia for the last 6 months or so. The Institute's a global organization headquartered out of Australia with our mission to advance CCS around the world, which includes the United States, certainly where we've seen a huge growth of projects, which are certainly associated with 45Q and California's low carbon fuel standard. We are a membership-based organization. Our members include governments, companies, and other interesting parties, including environmental NGOs. If you're interested in more information, certainly reach out to me directly. You'll hear from Jeff a little bit later, who is the general manager of the client engagement team, also out of DC. And we're happy to kind of interact and be cheerleaders for this important technology. We're both on LinkedIn as well, so certainly feel free to kind of reach out and connect with us and with all the speakers. One thing I really appreciate about the Global CCS community is we're all in this together. It's very collaborative. I think everyone wants to make this technology work because we think it's so important to address climate change. And so we hope to make this session as interactive, answering questions via the panels. And we also have some breakout sessions tomorrow, which I'll get into in just a minute. If you want to go to the next slide. Sonia, can you go to the next slide, please? There should have been one with the agenda. There you go. So just a little bit about what's going to happen over the next 2 days. We have 2 half days of sessions. We're going to start today with a great overview of the Texas landscape for CCS with Leslie Savage of the Texas Railroad Commission. Then we're going to go to Jeff Erickson, which is going to take us around the world and look at the status of CCS and then go into a little bit more about 45Q. We have some incredible panels this afternoon with, I would say, the leaders in the industry. You don't get much better than the people that we have on these panels in terms of their deep knowledge of CCS, putting projects together and understanding what's going on in Texas. And I'll kind of come back and share a little bit more about those individuals prior to each of their presentations. And then we'll wrap up and get ready for day 2 tomorrow. We'll start off with case studies. We'll talk about some challenges of deployment. And then, as I said, we do want to make this interactive. In the second half of the morning, we will have 3 sessions that will take place on a separate platform where we'll have the opportunity, or you'll have the opportunity as participants to really engage directly with the panels. You can turn on your webcams, have discussions, hopefully have discussions with other individuals, both the panelists and some experts who just might be in the audience and know a lot about CCS. So we hope that everyone will kind of stick with us. We know that staring at your computer for 2 half days is long, so we appreciate your commitment and your support for this. And so without any kind of further ado, I will pass this over to Leslie Savage. She's the Chief Geologist for the Oil and Gas Division for the Texas Railroad Commission. She has been working in this space for quite a while, obviously knows the Texas market inside and out, and hopefully can help us move forward and help that state move forward in getting CCS projects under the way. Thank you, Leslie, for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to go through just at least my vision of what's going on recently with CCS, and then also talk a little bit about the Texas framework from a regulatory standpoint. Whether or not you consider the science settled, there is a growing and unmistakable push for reductions in emissions of carbon dioxide. This is very clear from calls to ban fossil fuels, for calls from university, pensions funds, insurers, governments to divest from fossil fuels, and the declining enrollment in the university petroleum engineering programs. Investors and policymakers worldwide are rapidly increasing their focus on climate change. A recent DOE report clearly states that oil and gas will sustain modern life for, quote, the foreseeable future. So oil and gas is not going away immediately. Our ability to export oil and natural gas clearly enhances our energy and national security. However, those global customers are increasingly demanding low carbon energy. Even those that expect a reduction or elimination of fossil fuels still demand those products at low prices. A sudden shift towards the alternative fuels, which make up less than 40% of the U.S. power produced last year, could affect grid operators' ability to keep our lights on. And a rapid reduction in the use of fossil fuels will cause economic hardship on our most disadvantaged parts of the society. Industry is acting to reduce emissions, but because of the expense, the effort is generally limited to the majors. More commercial viable CCS opportunities will make it easier for these other companies to meet carbon reduction goals. And we need everyone to meet those goals. With a strong industrial base and, as a result, the highest CO2 emissions of any state, Texas needs CCS to compete in a decarbonizing world. Acceleration of CCS is a clear way to achieve that goal. Recently, I've seen greatly heightened interest in CCS, which is actually surprising during the pandemic. There have been bipartisan efforts in Congress as pressure to take action is increasing. Obviously, the 45Q tax credit, which I understand is going to be discussed later, will make CCS projects more profitable. The recent National Petroleum Council study on CCUS included several recommendations for government, both federal and state, as well as for industry, for actions to be taken to encourage rapid CCUS deployment. Actually, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission actually is exploring a possible role in state efforts to set a price on greenhouse gas emissions. Actually, that was kind of surprising to me. There's an increased push in several states to seek primacy from EPA for the Class 6 program, and Texas is one of those. In addition, the state Texas statutes require that the Texas School Land Board establish a CO2 repository in state submerged lands. And the School Land Board and BEG have taken the first steps towards establishing that repository as required by statute. They have identified suitable state-owned offshore submerged land. That was done in 2004. And just recently, September the 15th, the School Land Board approved the issuance of a request for proposals for the lease on school land in Jefferson County for the construction of any necessary infrastructure for the transportation and storage of CO2. And I've seen an increasing number of calls to the Railroad Commission regarding CCS. So it's heating up, and I was really surprised because it seems to be heating up during this pandemic. Texas has prime geology, business experience, and political support for CCS. 25% of the potential CCS projects under 45Q are in Texas. I'm now going to briefly describe the Texas CCS framework and the Railroad Commission's efforts towards encouraging CCS. And during the legislative session in 2009, the Texas legislature enacted Senate Bill 1387, which established the CCS framework for the state of Texas. It split jurisdiction over CO2 geologic storage between the Railroad Commission and the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. The Railroad Commission has jurisdiction over sequestration associated with enhanced recovery of oil or gas or geothermal energy, in reservoirs productive of oil, gas, or geothermal resources in past or potentially in the future, in saline formations directly above or below such reservoirs. Railroad Commission also under statute has jurisdiction over the extraction of the sequestered CO2 for any future use. Texas Commission on Environmental Quality has jurisdiction over sequestration of CO2 and other saline formations. With respect to CO2 ownership and stewardship, the stored CO2 is the property of the storage operator or his heirs, his or her heirs, successors, or assigns. Unless it's found to be abandoned, CO2 is not the property of the owner of the surface or mineral estate, and the statutes allow the owner to extract the anthropogenic CO2. Some other requirements: the state, both the TCQ and the Railroad Commission regulations must be consistent with EPA's Class 6 regulations, and the statutes do require the state agencies to seek primacy for the Class 6 program, although it did not include a deadline for that. Some activities to date: in December 2010, the Railroad Commission adopted rules for geologic storage of anthropogenic CO2 not associated with enhanced recovery. And we also adopted, and those are basically the Class 6 requirements, plus some fees to, that program is to be self-funding. Also in December 2010, the Railroad Commission, Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, Texas General Land Office, and the Bureau of Economic Geology issued the required joint report, basically reviewing our current statutory authority and making recommendations to the legislature. In January of 2011, the EPA regulations for Class 6 wells became effective. May of 2011, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality and the Railroad Commission amended its memorandum of understanding to address anthropogenic CO2 geologic storage. And in July of 2011, rules for geologic storage of anthropogenic CO2 associated with EOR were also adopted. With respect to delegation of the Class 6 primacy, as I mentioned, the Railroad Commission is required to seek delegation. We are currently preparing a package and working with the Groundwater Protection Council Class 6 work group, which is made up of states who have already received Class 6 primacy, as well as states who are interested in seeking that primacy. The benefits of delegation of Class 6 primacy, obviously, you only have one agency to deal with. You don't have to deal with the state and EPA. It would just be the state. So you'd have one permitting agency. The states generally have knowledge of the state geology, and that makes it easier for the state to review any applications that are submitted. The director, whether it be EPA in a direct implementation state or the primacy agency director, makes the determination regarding the transition from Class 2 to Class 6, which can be a huge issue. And so that with primacy, the state will make that decision. And also timeliness. So I know EPA is trying to get Class 6 permits out on in a timely manner, but I believe that the states can probably get those out faster, mostly because of our knowledge. There are some potential issues that I see. The issue of pore space ownership is not settled in Texas with respect to CO2 storage. There is split jurisdiction, which potentially could make it, number one, confusing, and number two, difficult to get primacy from EPA if they find that to be a problem. And with respect to differences in the Railroad Commission and EPA's Class 6 regulations, there are a few. We were in the process of adopting ours at the same time EPA was developing theirs, and so there are some differences as a result of that, but also as a result of Texas believing that this is the way to do it. Some of those differences include external mechanical integrity testing once every 5 years. There's no default post-injection monitoring period in the regulations. It's all based on modeling. There's no mandatory tracer or soil gas monitoring, although potentially it could be required in a particular area, but it's not mandatory in the Railroad Commission's regulations. And basically, the Railroad Commission regulations include more flexibility. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have a really good workshop. And I'd be happy to answer questions through the chat. Patricia can send those on to me. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Leslie. That was a really helpful overview. We appreciate you being here and just appreciate all the work that you've been doing over the last several years for CCS, and certainly how that could be the work that you're going to hopefully do going forward to make Texas a leader in carbon capture and storage. We're going to move on to Jeff Erickson. He is the general manager for client engagement here out of the DC office with me. Jeff has been working at the Institute for several years and so very involved in CCS. And his remit is actually global, so he'll be giving us a little bit of a beyond the US look as well of CCS. Thanks, Jeff.
Great, thank you, Patricia. Can you hear me okay, first of all?
Yes.
Terrific. I want to add my thanks to Leslie as well for her comments and setting the scene for what CCS will look like in Texas going forward. And a theme that I heard from her that's not unique to Texas, actually I've heard it from several states and in fact countries around the world, is that this place is a great place to invest in CCS. And so I see a bit of a competition emerging from state officials to bring that business and bring that investment into those particular states. We are going to be focusing very much on how to get projects done in Texas in this workshop, but I'm going to be stepping back a bit and giving folks a bit larger context, because I think understanding what's going on across the world is helpful to any developer or any stakeholder to understand how Texas in particular fits into the broader picture. So if you go to the next slide, please, Sonia. Several of the slides that I'll be using today are available and actually are pulled from our Global Status of CCS report, the 2019 version. We usually release that at COP every year in early December. Because COP's not happening this year, we're going to be doing a virtual launch, but that will be available. The 2020 version will be available on December 2nd this year, so you can pull that down from our website, available for free to the public beginning on December 2nd. A couple things from this global map of CCS projects. First of all, the large red dots are large-scale projects that are in operation or construction. Large blue are those that are in advanced development. By the way, there are many more in early stage development and kind of budding ideas that aren't reflected here. So there's a lot more activity going on with CCS projects in development than is reflected here on this map. And then the smaller dots you can see are pilot project or testing of research facilities. So a few things to pull from here. I think the thing that probably jumps out at you most from a first glance at this map is all of the activity that's happening in the United States. The United States has typically and historically been a leader in deploying carbon capture and storage projects. And we see that leadership continuing as we go forward. In fact, I'll get down into numbers in a bit. But that's the first thing you see from a look at the global map is how much activity is happening and will continue to happen in the US. A couple of other things to pull out of here. There's a lot of activity in Europe these days, and just in the last 2 years or so, there's been an awful lot of development in what's happening in Europe. The hub and cluster model is quite prominent in most, if not all, of the European projects that are under development, and that is migrating its way over to North America as well. You'll see there's projects in the Middle East that are developing, and the Middle East certainly shares some geological and geographic attributes with Texas. You know, the world's hotbed for oil and gas, and the Middle Eastern, both the governments in the Middle East and companies in the Middle East are recognizing that the world is moving towards a low carbon economy, and they want to be part of the solution, not left behind. You also see several projects that are being developed in China, and especially on the back of last month's announcement of net zero emissions, carbon emissions by 2060 that was announced by President Xi. We are anticipating more and more CCS activity in China in order to meet that long-term goal. And then I'll point you also to Australia. I'm going to call out just a couple of specific projects. One is in Australia, on the west coast of Australia, the Gorgon project. It's a dedicated geologic storage at an LNG export facility, and they are storing about 2 million tons per year currently, with a capacity to get up close to 4 million tons per year. That began operation, full-scale operation, just over a year ago in 2019. The other project that has come into operation more recently is the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line in Western Canada in the province of Alberta. That includes 2 facilities, a refinery and a fertilizer plant, that are the initial sources that are feeding into the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line, the pipeline. And there is room and design for many more facilities, industrial facilities in that industrial heartland in Alberta. The Alberta Carbon Trunk Line is currently pumping about 1.6 million tons of CO2 per year, storing it underground, using it for enhanced oil recovery. And there is a lot more capacity in that pipeline. They oversized the pipeline actually to anticipate some additional sources coming online. Sonia, if you go to the next slide, please. And as I think about what we're seeing looking ahead, the word that jumps out to me is momentum. There's a tremendous amount of momentum around the world for deploying more carbon capture and storage projects. You can see that for most of the last decade, the projects that are in development, have been on the decline as governments reduced their support and their funding for projects. And then beginning after the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015, we're seeing an uptick in CCS. And as I said, moving forward even more so. And in the status report, there'll be another bar that represents 2020, and that will be a significant increase in the amount of CO2 storage capacity in projects under development. So far, to date, since we've been keeping track, we've stored about 260 million tons of anthropogenic CO2 in the subsurface, and we're currently storing about 40 million tons per year. Now, what is 40 million tons? Is that a lot? Sonia, next slide. It is and it's not. So a couple of points of comparison on 40 million tons. First of all, it's equivalent to the energy use of about 4.7 million households. That's actually pretty close to the total number of households, detached houses in the state of Texas. It's equivalent to about 8.8 million cars, or about 40% of the cars on the road in Texas, or equivalent to the CO2 sequestered by about 53 million acres of forest. Again, almost equivalent to the amount of forests that are growing in the state of Texas. So that sounds like a lot. The Ivampa solar concentrated solar farm in California is one of, if not the largest solar farms in the world, and that is reducing CO2 emissions by about 400,000 tons of CO2 per year. So 40 million tons is equivalent to about 100 of the world's largest solar farms. Sounds great. Sounds like that's a lot of CO2. But the International Energy Agency has said that in order for CCS to contribute as it should in an optimized industrial and economic system, about 4 billion tons of CO2 per year needs to be sequestered by the year 2050. So 40 million tons is about 1/100th the annual requirement from CCS, according to the IEA. So there's a huge opportunity to grow the industry, and a huge need to grow the industry. Next slide, please, Sonia. A bit more of a breakdown on what the projects look like around the world. This is a little bit difficult to read, but on the left-hand side, we are categorizing the projects that are in operation and development by industry. So at the top is waste to energy. The band with a lot of projects in it are natural gas processing. And Sonia, if you could click once, please. You can see that there are currently 21 CCS projects in operation or operational. And that does include Petronova, which is operational but not currently operating due to difficult economics. There are 3 under construction. So Sonia, just pop through the next 3, if you would, please. 3 in construction. 1 of those is in the US, 2 are in China. Next click. 16 in advanced development and 19 that are early development. Advanced development essentially means they've been through feasibility study, and early development, 1 more click, indicates that it's a real project with a real funding, a real financial model that's in feasibility stage. You'll see that in power generation, both coal and natural gas, there's not a whole lot that are currently in operation, but there's plenty on the books, and nearly all of those are in the US. Okay, next slide. So speaking of the US, we have been and will remain the leader. Of the 21 operational facilities, 10 of them, almost half, are located in the US, and the majority of those that are in advanced development are also in the US. Next slide, please. I mentioned hubs and clusters as the emerging business model for CCS projects. We've identified 16, and again, this will be updated with a couple more hub and clusters that are in development in the status report that's coming out in a couple of months. But this is the prominent business model both in North America and around the world. The most recent announcement of a hub and cluster sequestration project is one that was announced by Gulf Coast Sequestration just last week. It's located in Louisiana. They have identified a storage field. They're working on getting commitments from emitters. They plan on storing about 2.7 tons per year of CO2, and over the life of the project, about 80 million tons total. Next slide, please. So one of the questions that's often asked is, isn't it difficult to make money on a CCS project? There's a couple of answers to that, but where I go first is there's actually 21 facilities that are in operation. So 21 project teams that have figured out a way to make or save money through their CCS projects. This is a chart that was included in our 2019 status report. It identifies the enabling conditions for all of the CCS facilities that are currently in operation. And I've added some prompters to the margins so that you don't have to squint too much to read those at the top. But essentially, there are numerous types of incentives that are available or enabling operating conditions that are available And all of the facilities that are currently in operation have more than one of those enabling conditions in place. So as you're thinking about what it is that you need to do to think about in order to have an economically viable facility in development and ultimately in operation, you should be looking at multiple enabling conditions that include both policy measures and what I would say are physical measures. Low cost of capture, which typically means high concentrations of CO2 at the emitters, low cost of transportation and storage, which means a good porous storage field located close to the emitters. And there's some business model considerations here as well. For example, vertical integration, meaning the same entity has responsibility for both the emissions and the storage, and provisions by government or state-owned entity, which occurs around the world, not so much in the US, but occurs in other countries around the world. And finally, one last slide before I stop. Just to look ahead, there's some things that we're pretty confident will continue that will certainly have an impact on the pace of deployment of CCS. First is the awareness and understanding of the climate change and the necessity to address it in a significant way. Related to that are the announcements and commitments for net zero emissions. You know, not too long ago, 5 years ago, companies were talking about a 20, 30, 50% reduction in emissions. In order to be identified as in the leading quartile right now from a climate action perspective, you really need to commit to net zero emissions. It's not a question of how far, it's a question of how fast will you get there. Will it be 2030, 2040, 2050 or beyond? ESG, environmental, social, and governance considerations, increasingly important for investors. And decarbonization is an important part of the E element of this. And of course, CCS is an important enabler of decarbonization. Hydrogen, we expect hydrogen to be an increasing part of our electricity systems, our mobility systems, and our heating systems. And it's a whole lot cheaper to generate zero carbon hydrogen with CCS than it is to create it with electrolysis and renewables. And we can expect continued US leadership on CCUS. Part of that's because of the experience of those in the US, but also it's part of the ongoing commitment and support that we're getting from our governments, both national and state level governments for CCS deployment. And then on the other side of the equation, the tea leaves, what are the things that are issues that we don't have a clear picture of how they'll take place and what kind of an impact they'll have going forward? Certainly the impact of COVID on the economy and the consumption of fossil fuels, the consumption of fuel in general will have an impact on the pace. The future of fossil fuels, again, we're seeing declining trends. The question is how far and how fast will those trends move forward? Geopolitics is a great question. You know, there's a lot of international collaboration that's required to deploy CCS. Right now, there's a lot of tension around the world between the various important players on the geopolitical scene. Color of hydrogen, will it be green hydrogen made with renewables or blue hydrogen made with CCS and fossil fuels is an open question. And then we're still trying to figure out what the best revenue model is, and that's not a one size fits all. That's going to vary based on local conditions. So that gives you a sense of what's happening kind of around the world in big picture. Like I said, we're going to be releasing our status report on December 2nd, and you can get the latest and greatest information from there. At this point, I'll hand it back, and we're going to focus first on the U.S. with 45Q, and then we're going to narrow down to how to get things done in Texas. Over to you, Patricia.
Thank you, Jeff. I've seen a lot of questions come through regarding whether we're recording it, having access to slides. We are recording this presentation. We will put it on our website, and when we do that, we include a PDF with the slides as well. So that all is available just for people who are asking the questions. So moving on to our next presenter, Keith Tracy. Thank you so much for joining us. He is a principal with Elysian Ventures. So certainly kind of one of the things he's doing is actually making 45Q work and projects. So he has a lot of experience as to how this can make projects actually happen, but just has been kind of involved in the CCS community for a long time. So we appreciate his kind of thoughts and work on 45Q, and hopefully this session will help many of you better understand this incentive. Thanks, Keith.
Great. Thank you, Patricia. It's my pleasure to be with you today, and thank you to the Global CCS Institute and the U.S. Energy Association for organizing this workshop. My name is Keith Tracy. I've been in the carbon capture and storage industry for about 14 years. I'm a principal with Elysian, and as Patricia mentioned, we're developing carbon capture projects. In our time together today, our goal is to provide an overview of the Section 45Q tax credit program. Next slide. At its highest level, 45Q is a federal tax credit incentive to capture CO2, and then once the CO2 is captured, either utilizing the CO2 to make a product or permanently storing it underground. The incentive is based on physical activity on a per metric ton basis, generating more tax credits if more CO2 is captured. For new projects, the credit will last 12 years from the date of first capture operations. And as we'll discuss later, the value of the credits are increasing every year. Essentially, 45Q has placed a price on carbon in the US. Next slide, please. I thought it would be helpful up front to provide a sort of a checklist of the things that someone might want to think about in order to qualify for 45Q credits. And this checklist will help guide our whole presentation today. This presentation takes into account not only the 2018 amendments to 45Q, but also the beginning of construction notice and the tax equity partnership revenue procedure issued by the IRS back in February, as well as the proposed regulations that were issued in June this last summer. So we will talk about what's being captured and how and where it has to be captured. We'll also talk about an important deadline for starting construction of carbon capture project that will qualify. Then we'll turn to how the CO2 can be used to store and where it's stored and under what requirements. Importantly, we'll focus on who gets the tax credits, and someone called tax equity we'll introduce you to. We'll also briefly discuss the proposed recapture regulations, and we'll clarify how much the credit is worth today and in future years, and have a few final thoughts. Next slide. So 45Q credits are based on the amount of carbon oxide that is captured. And I'm just going to say CO2, since the vast amount of carbon oxide that will qualify for the credits is most likely going to be CO2. The CO2 must be captured from being emitted into the air, or is directly captured from the air from a direct air capture plant or a DAC plant. So whether it's a DAC plant or an industrial facility, the CO2 must be measured where it's captured, and then that amount of captured CO2 has to be verified where it's stored, whether it's injected or disposed of underground, or it's utilized to make a product. There is a special rule for oil and gas. If it's an enhanced oil or gas project and there's the CO2 is recaptured and recycled and re-injected, there's no 45Q credit for that recycled CO2. Next slide. The CO2 has to be captured using carbon capture equipment. And there's a picture of that there in the background of carbon capture equipment that's actually capturing CO2 today. Carbon capture equipment is kind of a term of art used throughout the statute, but it was never defined. The proposed regulations from this summer actually have a very nice and broad definition. Practically any piece of equipment that has anything to do with diverting the CO2 from being emitted, as long as that piece of equipment is upstream of some pipeline or being loaded into a tanker, that's going to qualify as carbon capture equipment. The expansive list includes things like compressors and dehydrators that we kind of expected, but also included items that we may not have initially expected, like power generators that might be owned by others, or the flue gas duct that might be owned by the host plant. So this list is not quite the same as the beginning of construction guidance list back in February, but it's close, and we anticipate the IRS may end up harmonizing those two definitions. In some instances, the proposed regulations actually indicated that all of the listed pieces of equipment had to be owned by the same owner, which is inconsistent with how carbon capture works in some facilities. So, it's not a cookie cutter approach at every capture facility. And many comments made this last summer to the IRS sought to clarify this point and try to make sure that the list of equipment is just examples rather than requirements. And that's an item that we expect will be clarified in the final regulations. Next slide. So now that we have carbon capture equipment, we need to know where it has to be installed. It has to be at something called a qualified facility. This is an industrial facility or a power plant or a DAC plant. The industrial facility definition includes combustion sources that produce CO2, but also any manufacturing process, which was defined very broadly in the regulations. The historic exclusion of CO2 production wells was also carried into the regulations. One note on power plants. The regulations appear to narrowly define a power plant as only one that sells power like on the grid. So on-site power or distributed power plants that are not selling on the grid won't be classified under that depreciation classification, and so they're not included. That's actually helpful because, as the bottom of the slide indicates, power plants have to capture at least 500,000 metric tons a year, but other facilities only have to capture 100,000 metric tons as their annual minimum threshold. And utilization, in most instances where it will be deployed, will have a 25,000 metric ton a year threshold. The regulations actually allow those minimum thresholds to be annualized in the first year. So the carbon capture project doesn't have to start in January to meet this annual threshold. It can start in August, for example. The applicable facility rules on the box to the right are for older carbon capture projects that qualified under the pre-2018 program, but never claimed credits. And that's a picture of one, and they're allowed to claim credits under the new higher credit value program. Next slide. So a quick word on direct air capture plants, which remove CO2 directly from the atmosphere. The DAC plant is effectively both the qualified facility as well as the carbon capture equipment. Their annual minimum threshold is 100,000 metric tons per year of CO2 captured for 45Q purposes. And they have the same requirements to measure the CO2 and verify the CO2 regardless of where it's stored. Next slide. So now that we know where our carbon capture equipment will be and we know where to place it in service at a qualified facility, the next question is, where does all this have to be built? There's two separate timing requirements here. One is construction has to start sometime before January 1st, 2024. This deadline applies to the qualified facility or the emitter. It also applies to carbon capture equipment unless the qualified facility to be built has carbon capture in its design, and they'll just plan to actually construct it later. Next, what do we have to do to start construction? Well, the IRS in Notice 2020-12 says exactly what has to be done, and it heavily relied upon guidance from the wind and solar tax credits. There's a physical work test, and the notice includes a lot of examples of types of things where you can start construction, like pouring foundations or buying certain equipment or even funding a feed study. Another way to start construction is to incur at least 5% of the total capital cost of the entire project. You have to make sure you've counted all the possible CapEx. Another important issue is, once construction started, how long do we have to complete the project? And the general rule is 6 years, which is more favorable than the 4 years that the IRS had previously allowed for the wind energy projects. Next slide, please. So we next need to think about where the CO2 is going to be stored. We have two general options to qualify for 45Q tax credits: utilization and something we call secure geologic storage. So let's first talk about utilization. This is defined by the statute as doing something like photosynthesis, like growing algae, or another way to utilize it is to chemically convert the CO2 to some other material or compound such as the project on the right where CO2 is converted into baking soda. And then there's a third category for utilization. It's kind of more of a catch-all provision, which basically says that CO2 can be utilized for any other purpose for which a commercial market exists. Now, this provision's been receiving quite a bit of increased attention lately, including public comments this last summer in response to the proposed regulations. And it's been interesting to see what the different ideas are on the intent behind this provision. Next slide. So continuing with utilization, there is a requirement in 45Q that the amount of CO2 that's stored through utilization has to be determined based on a life cycle analysis. The proposed regulations actually give us some explanation of what the required LCA is. For example, you have to use the ISO 14044 standard, and you have to have a third party involved. The IRS won't allow self-certification. Agency involvement is pretty heavy here, where the DOE is going to perform a technical review, and then the IRS will approve the LCA report, but only after consulting with DOE and EPA. The proposed regulations actually state that a full life cycle analysis is required rather than a gate-to-gate approach that was advocated by some. There's still a lot of unanswered questions after seeing the proposed regulations. I've listed some of those there for you. You can review them later at your leisure. Next slide. So the other option for where CO2 is going to be permanently stored is underground in what we call secure geologic storage. This can be in many different kinds of reservoirs or formations. Saline aquifers and depleted oil and gas reservoirs are very popular choices. When talking about secure geologic storage, the 45Q credit program distinguishes between injection and disposal. Injection is where CO2 is injected into an oil and gas formation for enhanced oil recovery or enhanced gas recovery. And in the process, the CO2 is permanently stored in the reservoir. And the picture on the right is a CO2 EOR injection well. Disposal, on the other hand, is where CO2 is just put underground. It's not used for EOR or EGR. And an example of that is storage in a saline aquifer. These distinctions are important because, as we'll see later, the 45Q credit value is different for injection versus disposal. Also, how secure geologic storage is demonstrated is different for both categories. For injection, secure geologic storage requires either compliance with subpart RR of the EPA Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, or compliance with the ISO standard that came out recently, 27916. That's for injection. For disposal, only the subpart RR method is available to show secure geologic storage for 45Q. I might mention here that subpart RR requires EPA approval of something called a monitoring, reporting, and verification plan. 2 of those have been approved for disposal, and 3 of those have been approved for injection. And finally, if the ISO standard is the chosen method for demonstrating that the CO2 is securely stored, then a third-party qualified engineer or geologist must provide certain certifications, and those have to be given to the IRS, or the credits will actually be disallowed. Next slide. So now the carbon capture equipment is placed in service at a qualified facility, and the CO2 is being utilized or stored in secure geologic storage, then we need to determine who gets the 45Q credit for all this activity. Well, 45Q credits may be claimed by the owner of the carbon capture equipment. Now, the owner has this obligation to physically utilize, inject, or dispose the CO2, or the owner can sign a contract and have their contracting party do those things of utilizing, injecting, or disposing of the CO2. I'm going to call that contracting party the storage co. So if the owner decides to contract with storage co for utilization or injection or disposal, then there has to be a binding written contract between those 2 parties, and that contract has certain limitations and requirements, and I've listed some of them there. For example, storage co has the obligation to inject or dispose or utilize, and the owner has to be able to enforce those obligations. If storage co is injecting or disposing, there has to be a contractual obligation that they're going to follow the secure geologic storage rules we just talked about, as well as the recapture regulations we're going to get to in a minute. So some of this contract information has to be reported to the IRS as well. So to repeat, the owner of the carbon capture equipment gets to claim the 45Q credit. But the owner has this unique ability, and I don't think it's found in any other federal tax program. And that is that the owner has the ability to transfer that tax credit to the storage co that we talked about. The IRS calls that person the credit claimant. It's the company that does the utilization, the injection, or the disposal. So the owner can make this election to transfer the 45Q credit to the credit claimant. And they've got flexibility. They can transfer some of the credits, they can transfer all the credits, they can even transfer credits to multiple credit claimants. And these elections are made every year, so it enhances the flexibility that we have in implementing the program. And there's one other big topic related to who gets to claim the tax credits, and that appears on the next slide. So let's go to that one. So I'm not going to cover everything that's on this slide, but I want to introduce you to our friends called tax equity. So 45Q, if you think about it, is a very significant tax credit. The tax credits work only to offset federal income tax liabilities. In some instances, we can generate a lot of tax credits. You know, if there's a 1 million metric ton project in 2026, it's going to generate $50 million in tax credits per year for disposal. Many carbon capture projects don't involve parties that have tax liabilities of $50 million a year. But some taxpayers do have that kind of appetite for tax credits, and when they invest in a project like this to receive an allocation of the tax credits, they're called tax equity. And the IRS recognizes this commercial reality, and as with other tax credits in the past, they've issued a revenue procedure that explains the rules, if you will, for how a tax equity investor can make this kind of investment. For example, the investor has to pay at least 20% of their total investment up front. And another rule, at least half of their investment cannot be contingent. The IRS has actually provided some favorable provisions in the revenue procedure, such as excluding operational costs when thinking about the 50% pay-go, and allowing take-or-pay or supplier pay contracts. There's much more detail that your tax lawyer will probably be happy to explain to you, but the big takeaway here is that the IRS has provided very clear guidance on how these tax equity partnerships can be structured, and the tax equity investor takes on the risk of those structures. And this guidance is one of the biggest things the tax equity market was waiting for in order to enter the 45Q credit business. Next slide. So since 2008, the 45Q statute said that the IRS needed to adopt regulations to explain when and how the IRS might recapture or claw back 45Q credits in the event that CO2 might have leaked from somehow from where it was injected or disposed of underground. Now I want to start this discussion on recapture with just a couple of facts. A large major CO2 EOR company with decades of experience in carbon capture and storage has publicly stated that their storage ratio is 99 point something in the amount of CO2 that is stored. And so the amount that's not stored, that's leaks from operational upset conditions on the surface. A smaller CO2 EOR operator recently released their information for over a decade of operations. Their storage percentage was in excess of 97%, with none of it leaking from the reservoir. This is consistent with the general experience in the EOR industry, and those with disposal operations are not having reservoir leakage either. So the second thing I want to point out on this slide is the italicized part there, kind of halfway down in the middle. I call this the current year offset principle, because the regulations say that there's no potential for recapture unless the amount of CO2 that leaked from the reservoir exceeds the amount that was injected in that particular year. Well, based on the track record of the EOR industry, if this recapture rule had been around for the last 50 years, we would have never had a recapture event. If there is a recapture event, the IRS has adopted rules, proposed regulations that will take a LIFO approach to recapture. That's a very practical method. And the look back period is up to 5 years from the date of last injection, unless the MRV plan allows that monitoring period to end before that time. Next slide, please. You are all probably very familiar with the value of the 45Q tax credits, but they're about $20 a metric ton today for injection into EOR or EGR, and about $32 a metric ton for disposal. Those numbers climb over the next 5 years to $35 and $50 a metric ton respectively. And then after 2027, those amounts are adjusted based on inflation. Some examples are shown at the bottom where a 100,000 metric ton project, kind of a minimum size industrial project, if it began next year, it would generate between $40 and $60 million in tax credits over a 12-year time period. A minimum size power plant project would generate about $200 million in tax credits or more. Next slide. So briefly, a word about carbon capture facilities that existed in early 2018. Those facilities can install additional carbon capture equipment and qualify for the new credit values in limited circumstances. Also, one of these older facilities can retrofit themselves and render the project a new facility, making themselves eligible for the higher credit value if the used components in the property don't exceed 20% of the total value. The other thing about the older program is that there was a sunset of the program once 75 million metric tons had been claimed in the aggregate in the US. And the IRS has been issuing annual notices since 2013, reporting on the status and trying to give us a sense of when that sunset's going to occur. And based on the trend and the most recent information, it looks like those old credit values will probably sunset in 2021, unless something significant changes. Next slide, please. The proposed regulations contain a number of instances in which the IRS is collecting information about many of the items that we've just discussed, including who claims the tax credit, who they've contracted with, where the carbon capture equipment is located, where the qualified facility is located to. They want to know where the CO2 is going, including the EPA ID information for the storage facility. And if the credit is transferred to one of the credit claimants, they want to know a lot of details about that transaction as well in order to trace the credits. The last statement on this slide is actually very important. The regulations make clear the credits won't be allowed if all of the information that they require is not timely provided. Most of it will be required on Form 8933 and its instructions, but it would be wise to develop a checklist of what needs to be reported so that you don't fall into that trap. Next slide. As we think about carbon capture and storage projects, there's a number of potential business partners that will be needed on any project. You know, some of these functions may be internalized at a qualified facility or at an emitter, but in many instances, most, if not all of these business partners will be needed. So you might give that some thought as you think about developing a project or getting involved. Next slide, please. There is some clarity needed on when certain 45Q rules are applicable, and the purpose of this slide is just to explain this issue. I'm going to highlight what's underlined. So the statute was effective for tax years 2018 and forward. The proposed regulations are actually, while they're proposed and people can comment on them, you can rely on them immediately, but you can't rely on them for 2018 for most people, and it only applies to 2019 and forward. And then the last thing is about the final regulations. So the draft that we see and the proposed regulations tell us that the final will be effective the year after those regulations are published. So if final regulations don't come out until 2021, for example, then the final regulations may not be applicable until 2022. It would be nicer if those have the ability to opt into them sooner. Next slide. Slide 20 provides some background on the history of 45Q, if that's interesting to you. So that's on the left. I'm not going to go over it. On the right-hand side, though, is kind of a quick look at some things that have been happening on Capitol Hill in 2020. And currently, the activity appears to be focused on one of the items we discussed, that January 1, 2024 deadline to begin construction. There's some efforts to extend that deadline by either 2 years or 5 years, or there's even been a bill to eliminate that deadline altogether. Another set of proposals that have been interesting is focused on a topic of what some people call direct pay. Many think of it in terms of really a more efficient use of the tax credit. So if that was enacted, it would treat the 45Q credit as a payment of estimated tax. So that the owner of the carbon capture equipment would actually receive 85 or 90% of the credit value right there on their tax return. Next slide. So this last slide is more of just a resource for you in case you want to see where major 45Q related topics are mentioned, not only in the statute, but also in the proposed regulations or in the IRS guidance or the revenue procedure that have been issued earlier this year. Next slide. Patricia, I think this concludes the formal aspects of the presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have or that may be coming in. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we actually haven't had a whole lot of questions specific to 45Q. I know everyone, I see your questions on kind of a variety of topics, but if you have 45Q specific questions, please send them now. But I'll kind of share a couple that we've had. One is, can you elaborate on the types of equipment used to capture the CO2 and injection disposal? So I'm not sure if that's a generic question or a 45Q specific question, but I imagine you can kind of give an answer to that.
So the type of equipment that we're seeing?
Yes, I guess used to capture the CO2 and injection disposal.
So in some instances where CO2 is being emitted into the air, the emission stream is relatively pure. And so some of the equipment that's needed is compression, dehydration equipment, maybe some equipment to take out some contaminants such as H2S or other things like that. Other emission points are more of a traditional flue stack where it is a true combustion stream, the results of a combustion stream. And so the CO2 content is mixed in with a whole lot of air, and the concentration of the CO2 is less than 15% and maybe much smaller than that. And so separating the CO2 from all the other components in that emission can require a lot more equipment. Amine equipment and others are very popular choices currently in the marketplace, and some of those facilities can cost quite a bit of a whole lot of money. So we're seeing compressors, we're seeing even there is a laundry list. I could probably just pull it up here and read it to you, but it is a fairly lengthy list in the proposed regulations of what types of equipment. It's pretty expansive. So anything that might even separate or process the CO2 actually got included in what we would just generically call capture equipment.
Okay, great. This is a very specific question. So does a feed count as an advanced engineering stages, or must an EPC contract be awarded, or other? What's your interpretation?
I'm sorry, does an EPC contract have to be awarded or what?
So it's, does a feed study count as advanced engineering stages, or must an EPC contract be awarded?
From my memory, and I'll have to be corrected, but from my memory of reading the beginning of construction guidance in Notice 2020-12, a feed study would qualify as one of the things that can be used to help start construction. Now, if that is incorrect, I will clarify that on the breakout session tomorrow.
So another question we have that just came in regarding 45Q, is there any language in the proposed rule to identify which companies are claiming the credit? And then they ask, or will DOE publish the results of their technical reviews? And so maybe you can share some information with kind of the previous tax credit and how you can find out.
So two questions there. One is identity of the taxpayer and who is actually claiming the credit. There are some statutes outside of 45Q that require the IRS to keep individual taxpayer information private and confidential. So that information would not be disclosed. The question about the DOE doing their technical review of the utilization life cycle analysis, there's not much information in the regulations about how that would be done, when that would be done, and how long it would take, or the results of that. And one question I have is whether other parties can rely on that same LCA, or whether each party has to come in and get their same LCA approved. So there's still a lot of work to be done on utilization, especially in the LCA category.
Great. Another somewhat specific question. How do you think using CO2 to make renewable natural gas with hydrogen would be evaluated on an LCA basis?
Yeah, so I'm not going to be able to get into the details of the LCA itself, but the concept of using CO2 to make a transportation fuel like that is certainly an item that many have commented to the IRS and said in that kind of catch-all provision that really a transportation fuel ought to be authorized there. But if you want more details on how to do the LCA, it looks like they have adopted the ISO 14044 standard. And so apparently I have not been involved with that in great detail, but apparently people who've used that standard find it to be very workable and very straightforward of how that would be done.
Okay. What would happen if a facility captures less CO2 in a particular year than the threshold requires?
Yeah, it's a great question.
I thought so too.
Yeah, it's something that we've struggled with because if you read a technical reading of the statute and the regulations would say that you are not able to claim credits in that particular year. And as a result, and so let's say it's a 12-year tax credit period. Let's say in year 5, you don't meet the annual minimum threshold. You miss out on year 5 and you don't get to pick it back up. There's not a year 13 at the back end to try to get a full 12 years. You just miss it completely.
And I would say kind of a similar related question, are force majeure events excluded from any clawbacks? Or so if a hurricane destroys a pipeline storage location and CO2 is vented?
Yeah, the regulation for recapture does provide a couple of force majeure exemptions. The ones they specifically called out was volcano activity or terrorist attack. The many comments were made to the IRS saying, why don't we expand that to be generally accepted commercial norms of what is force majeure and not just those two only. And so we are anticipating that the force majeure exception on recapture would be expanded.
In one of your slides, Keith, you mentioned this kind of concept of eliminating minimum threshold requirements, and that was potentially proposed. Can you share anything else about that as to, if you've heard more as to whether you actually think that's going to come through?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't have details on the current status of it, but I do find it interesting of who introduced the concept. 2 Republican House members introduced it as part of the House Republicans' climate change package. So some might initially think that that might be more of a Democratic proposal from a Democrat side than the Republican side, but this came from Republicans. So some view that with hopeful anticipation.
I have a question here about kind of EOR and, how is CO2 reported when it returns to surface as a fraction of EOR oil and gas?
Oh, I'm not sure I can comment on as far as a fraction of EOR, but yes, when EOR is performed, some CO2 does come back and produced with the oil, but every EOR instance that I know of, it is recaptured and recompressed and re-injected. There's a lot of money invested in getting that CO2 to the site. No one wants to vent it. They want to put it to use again. It's cheaper than buying new CO2. So it is a commodity that is important. And so they want to get it back downhole and make use of it. The 45Q applies just on the initial purchase, not on any CO2 that gets recycled at that facility.
Thank you. Someone commented that they liked your statistics that 97 to 99% of CO2 would stay stored or has stayed stored in prior projects, and asked, could you share the source for that data or mention projects that were referenced?
Patricia, let's talk offline and see if there's a way that we can get that information out.
Okay.
It's been publicly made available. I just want to make sure that we get the right sources and to use so that everyone can see that if they're interested. I just don't have it off the top of my head, so I can't do that.
No problem. Let me see if there are any other questions here.
While you're looking, I saw one that may have come from a fellow panelist, so I'm going to take that. There was a question that said, can you explain exactly how direct pay would work? Would dollars flow directly to the claimant? Direct pay, or the enhanced efficiency that we're looking for, if the legislation that we've seen is enacted, it would treat the tax credit as if it is a payment of estimated tax. If the credit is treated in that way, then it's treated as an estimated tax payment, like you would make an estimated tax payment ordinarily. And if you happen to have more estimated tax payments than you have tax liabilities, then there would be a positive, there would be a number there at the end of your tax return that would indicate that money would be flowing back to the taxpayer who made that filing.
And I see we actually had another question that came through from another panelist asking, could you clarify how much risk a project developer is facing by relying on the proposed regs until the regs are finalized?
Yeah, good question. The proposed regulations are available in what I think administrative law would call temporary regulations. They're effective immediately if you want to rely on them, is the way that they're worded. So a taxpayer can choose to rely on them, but there's one caveat. You can't pick and choose what regulations you want to rely on and which ones you want to ignore. They're all together and you have to rely on all of them or none of them. So it's an all or nothing approach, but they can be relied on today.
Great. Here's a crystal ball question, and for the person who proposed it, I'll maybe bring it up in kind of.
I don't have one around here, but I'll try.
How will the outcome of the election affect proposed changes, i.e. start of construction date? What's your best guess there, Keith?
That's a great question. I don't have tea leaves on my slides like Jeff did, so it's tough to anticipate. I will tell you that I would echo what he has said about the momentum, even during this particular calendar year. The momentum behind carbon capture is very strong, and I haven't seen it this strong in a long time. And I think we're seeing input and interest level from both sides of the aisle on Capitol Hill. I think you see that in the proposals that I've mentioned there and other information that you see out there. So I can't prognosticate here. Let's just see what happens, and then we'll take it one step at a time.
Another question we've gotten, is it required by the IRS to have state licensed professionals working on the CCS disposal projects in order to claim the 45Q tax credit?
When the question is asking about state licensed professionals, it makes me think about the secure geologic storage topic that we talked about, and the ISO standard there, and the professional engineer, petroleum engineer, professional engineer, or geologist. And so that's what I think the question is focused on. And the answer is no, there's currently nothing in the regulation that says that person, to my memory, that person has to be state qualified or certified. I do know that some were thinking about that and made some comments to the IRS to see if that should be a requirement for that professional. But my memory is that the regulation doesn't currently require it.
And potentially, that's another question I can bring up in kind of future panels. Some of our other panelists may have some opinions there. So we were actually at just at kind of the top of the time for this session. So I'm going to make that the last question. Just to let you know, Keith will be back again tomorrow in a breakout session. In those breakout sessions, as I explained kind of at the beginning of this webinar, you will actually have the ability to put your mic on, put your kind of webcam on, and have more of an interactive conversation with Keith. So we will be sharing, you'll kind of leave this meeting and go into a GoToMeeting meeting. We'll share those links tomorrow. But certainly if there are questions that you'd specifically more like to talk through, you will definitely have the opportunity to do that tomorrow. So kind of keep those questions and stay engaged for that session. But Keith, thank you so much for this presentation. I've gotten a bunch of comments which I didn't share that said, thanks, it was a great presentation, that you explained things very in ways that were more easily understood than people have heard before. So we certainly appreciate, and we hope that, you know, that the people here in the sessions can benefit from that in terms of thinking about how to make their CCS project successful. So we will have a break for 10 minutes. You don't need to really do anything. We're not going to shut this down and reopen it. It will just be here. We'll just kind of call things back to order in 10 minutes and have our next panel session start up then. So thank you very much, and we'll talk to you again in a couple minutes. Hi, I think that we're going to get started again. I hope that everyone is back from their break. For our next panel, we will have, again, 3 individuals with a huge amount of experience in carbon capture. This is just going to be a conversation, no presentations. I will start with asking some questions of the presenters, but certainly feel free to keep sharing questions in that chat box. And we will get to those as we did in kind of the previous sessions. We have Richard Esposito with us, who is from Southern Company. He is the R&D program manager and part of the Geosciences and Carbon Management Group. We have Tony Catone, who's a senior director of strategic development of Oxy Low Carbon Ventures. I think that he's having some video problems, so I think we'll just hear his voice during this presentation. And then Nigel Genvy, who is the Global Head of Carbon Management for Gasoline Klein. Thank you all for joining me today.
Great to be here.
Thank you, Patricia.
So I'm going to start with a question for Richard. And, you know, I think we're going to take ourselves back a step here and talk a little bit more about, you know, what is a CCS project? What are the elements of a project? You know, we talk about capture, transportation, and storage. A little bit about what are the, you know, relative percentage of overall costs of those. And then we've also gotten questions of, is direct air capture a CC project? Is utilization a CCS project? So maybe kind of taking that step back as to looking at, you know, what does CCS mean?
Okay, thank you, Patricia. I appreciate the opportunity today. And I think we're preaching to the prior at looking at the title of this presentation. Texas is so far ahead of everybody in the country, in my opinion, on things that they've done already. I'm really inspired. And I do have my crystal ball with me. So Keith didn't have one with him, but I have my crystal ball right here, so I'll be able to answer questions with it. But I mean, the first general thing is understanding the drivers and the need for CCS. So that's going to be vastly different between the electrical power industry and just the general industry, like chemical industry or other industries that are trying to decarbonize. I mean, in the power industry, we're looking at, you know, when and if we really need CCS. I think we do, but you know, there's a lot of fuel switching from coal to gas, and then what are you going to do with gas? Are you going to have negative emissions to make up for those emissions? So I think that you know, there's a lot of issues there. A lot of technology options right now. I mean, on capture, although on a commercial scale, there's really just advanced amines is the main thing for commercial operations on you know, at that scale. But you know, with other industries that have maybe a little bit more pure stream of CO2 or lower volumes, there are technologies such as membranes that are coming into play, and so there are going to be some more options moving forward. Transport, you know, that's externalities. That's getting right-of-ways. You know, there's so many CO2 pipelines across the country right now that we're, you know, that's a pretty mature technology. It's just a matter of getting the right-of-ways, considering that. And on storage, I think storage, the big issue is risk. And a lot of people used to think it was once the risk of secure storage of the CO2 being staying in the reservoir, but I think from a risk standpoint, it's offtake risk as well. Because I mean, look what's happened with the NRG project. If you're using an EOR operator, you know, as an offtaker, and the price of oil goes negative, or COVID or something like that happens, you know, there are hazards to carbon capture projects and decarbonization associated with the sink. So I think there needs to be a lot of thought on that. And then on costs, I mean, costs is the major thing right now that's really inhibiting this CCS from being deployed widespread. And the understanding, in my opinion, I mean, R&D is very important, and we are learning so much from R&D. But a really big issue is the FOAK to NOAK. It's the first of a kind projects and understanding the cost reductions to the next of a kind projects. And that's why projects like the NRG Petronova project and the Boundary Dam project are so important, because now we're realizing that those initial costs are going to be 20, 30, 40% lower. And then understanding the incentives. We have Keith did an excellent presentation on 45Q. There's 48A that's kind of out there that may be applicable one day. The direct pay is potentially a big issue. You know, that looks like a real stimulant moving forward. So understanding and how to monetize and how to use these incentives is real important.
Thanks, Richard. I'm going to stick with you for one more minute. You know, back to what is a little bit more about capture technology. I know that a lot of the projects in the United States are post-combustion projects, but can you just briefly talk through the different types of capture technologies and where we might be seeing kind of changes from that traditional dominance of post-combustion carbon capture?
Right. Good question. Yeah. I mean, right now, I hate to say it, but there's not real a lot of options. There's amine technologies that are being deployed on coal. There hasn't been any large scale commercial types of demonstrations done on natural gas. And there's a big difference between the flue gas concentration of CO2 between coal and gas. But, facilities like the National Carbon Capture Center and the Wyoming Test Center and the Test Center Mondstadt are developing these different technologies such as membranes, solid sorbents, ionic liquids, and different things to provide more options. And even direct air capture is a different option, right? It's a type of carbon capture technology, and technologies like the alum cycle, which is being developed there in Texas. I mean, those are all really needed so that anyone who wants to decarbonize has options, and that it's not just the traditional amines, which are going to be the technology that you're competing to deploy.
Thanks so much. So I'm going to pass the next question off to Tony, and we're going to dive a little bit deeper into sequestration. Again, still at a somewhat macro level, understanding some of these concepts before we get down into Texas. So, Tony, I know that you do a lot of work helping companies think through a CCS project. And a lot of times that storage element is just outside of their general level of expertise.
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit about, what does permanently sequestering CO2 mean? A little bit about how much the volume of pore space you need for a given project, elements of good pore space, the permitting that is required on those projects, just to kind of give a sense to some of our participants here.
Absolutely. And this is Anthony Catone. Great to be here. This is a bit of a lengthy answer, but bear with me, because this is obviously an important part of putting the project together, and it may be one of the least understood aspects of it. From a carbon sequestration project operator standpoint, that they're really having to manage several elements in order to successfully execute a project where you're permanently sequestering CO2 underground. And so I really put those into 3 or 4 buckets. I'll talk to 3 of them. You have securing pore space, so actually getting the land. You have the actual pore space volume, and then permitting and certification of that pore space. I'm not going to get into sort of the engineering, design, and execution for the sake of time. On the securing pore space front, what you're going to have is the project operator must have the sequestration rights to all of the pore space where the CO2 plume is going to travel and migrate to over time. The pore space rights actually reside with the surface landowner, which is different from typical oil and gas, which is really owned by the mineral rights. And that's in most parts of the country. So the operator is really going to need to find a large contiguous surface land area, preferably owned by one entity. Otherwise, you're negotiating easements with several landowners and sort of patching this thing together over time, and that can be timely and costly. Identifying those landowners is pretty much a manual process. Think about sort of going down to the county, state offices to do that. We have land specialists that do that to sift through physical records of that kind. And then the operator needs to incentivize that landowner to work with them. So usually that's through some royalty structure. That is really not well defined, because this is all new to the market, and so there's probably some early examples of that evolving as we speak. And so it can be pretty challenging in a pure sequestration play, where sometimes the certification requirements actually prohibit drilling through that sequestration zone. So when you're thinking about CARB certification, you're not allowed to penetrate that zone. And so if someone has rights to oil and gas under the zone that you've leased in terms of the surface land, then that can create some issues. So that's about securing pore space. In terms of the pore space volume, you're really going to need a team of geologists and engineers. They're going to model the geologic characteristics in this area, looking for caps, looking for faults and fractures, and really predict the behavior of that CO2 plume during the injection phase. So The aerial extent of the plume is what determines the surface acreage required. And so you're really going to need enough pore space to understand how far that's going to go out, how far the CO2 plume is going to go out. And so operators should really consider securing enough area to have a buffer in case the plume exceeds their initial model expectations, or else you may be trespassing on someone's land. The total storage capacity is what determines the useful life of an injection well. Once the well reaches its maximum storage capacity, the project operator is going to have to drill a new injection well and continuing sequestering CO2. And so it's going to be the subsurface team that sort of determines the injection rate per well. If I could sort of put this into simple terms here, you have an underground tank essentially. The size of that tank is determined by the thickness of the reservoir and the porosity, right? And then how quickly you can fill that tank is determined by the permeability, so the connections within that reservoir and the thickness of that reservoir. And so that's going to get into your injection rate. So if you don't have a thick, highly porous rock that will spread the plume out, that's going to spread the plume out over a larger surface extent. And so that's going to cost more money, it's going to require more wells, and you're going to have to buy more land to cover that plume. You also might consider having backup wells and backup capacity there. So that was the pore space volume. Permitting is sort of the last issue I wanted to talk about, and I can do that quickly since I'm taking up some time here. CCUS projects, as we said, they're driven by government incentives, namely 45Q and LCFS. Today, projects have to be certified under EPA's MRV, Monitoring, Reporting, Verification Program, and California Air Resources Board Protocol. You generally need someone that has experience to comply with these things. And permitting is really the longest lead item process for developing a sequestration site, which will include a class 6 well for dedicated sequestration. Those are some of the things that you should think about when permitting. I can talk more about permitting and certification in a breakout or in Q&A.
Thank you very much. That was really helpful. And we're getting some questions on that. And so I might move into some of these online questions, but I'm going to move over to Nigel for 1 minute to talk about this, give a little bit of the specific Texas context. We heard Leslie talk about the fact that pore space and mineral rights, there's still some work to be done to address that in the Texas context. Nigel, do you want to go into a bit more detail there as to what the issue is and what we can potentially hope to see from the legislature after kind of the next year or so?
Yeah, thanks, Patricia. So yeah, I'll clarify though. I think at the start, I'm not a lawyer, and really, of course, such professional opinions should be sought. But I have been working on CCUS since 2004, and have developed many projects and operated, and also actually closed a project. So. I also, for Texas and the issue of pore space, we really should acknowledge some of the work that's been done by the University of Houston, the Bauer School, Rice University, and University of Texas, BEG. This is a really important issue. It's kind of not as clear as Tony mentioned, in that the pore space is owned by the surface owner. It's really important in this activation phase of deployment, because commercial viability really depends on whether and how property rights issues are going to be resolved. And the current situation is indeed that clarifications are still required, as Leslie mentioned earlier on. I think everything's bigger in Texas. It's the largest producer of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, with just over 700 million tons of CO2 emissions per year. Approximately half of that is from stationary emission sources, but it also has the largest CO2 storage capacity in the United States. The DOE NEPL Carbon Storage Atlas, the 5th edition, the last one, estimates this to be between 500 billion tons to 4,500 billion tons of CO2. That's thousands of years of storage capacity. So nowhere else in the world has that potential. Anyway, so prior to injection, operators have got to either own the pore space, have permission from the owner, or have a statutory or common law right to use the pore space. And that is indeed to avoid potential liability or exposure to trespass and nuisance claims. In the US, the law concerning private property rights, of course, is a basic responsibility of the state rather than the federal government. And although state law generally supports surface owner title, the question of whether the surface estate or mineral estate owns the private property interest in the pore space is not clearly settled. And a few states, therefore, have enacted legislation to clarify that, and that's how much of an issue this is. In Texas, there's been activity. In 2010, a joint report, and this is important, a joint report by the Texas General Land Office, the Railroad Commission of Texas, and the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality concluded that, and quote, Texas statutory law does not address which estate, surface or mineral, possesses ownership of the pore space for storage purposes unless the contract severing the surface and mineral estates expressly specifies. Therefore, Texas would have, again quotes, benefit from clear rules on how these rights will be recognized and protected, as well as the process for assuring that the storer secures the legal property right to store carbon dioxide. There is that clarification that's still required to really ease risks and uncertainty in this aspect.
That was really helpful, Nigel. Thanks. I think that really provided some good context on Texas. As I said, we're getting a variety of questions just on storage. So before we do have some other topics we want to talk about here in the panel in my prepared questions, but I am going to get some of these questions out while we're on the topic. So one of the questions was, what about the larger area of elevated pressure, AOR? This area of elevated pressure in brine is used by the project and is not available for another project. Do owners in the pressure plume receive any payment? And either Nigel or Tony, either of you can kind of feel free to respond, I think.
Looks like Nigel shaking his head.
It's definitely a question. So, of course, the pressure plume and pressure is causing movement of fluids. Whether there's, of course, going to be any prevention of using of the property rights and the pore space because of that pressure is a question indeed that needs to be resolved. Certainly, the area of view within a Class 6 permit, of course, has to look at the potential, of course, for brine to move into and contaminate underground sources of drinking water within that area. But of course, there is also question marks, I'd say, around whether that causes any private owner of acreage any access issues to the property that they own.
Thank you. We have a question here. Is there a minimum distance requirement from fault? And I'll ask this question. We'll probably be talking about this again tomorrow. We'll have someone from EDF here, and that's certainly, as an environmental NGO, some of their priority to ensure that these projects don't have a negative impact on the local environment. But I'll throw this out here to see if anyone has an answer for that question.
Sorry, Patricia, did you put that to me?
Yeah, Tony, if you're able to answer that.
Sorry, I'm not familiar exactly with the permitting requirements when it comes to faults. I know that when we are doing a subsurface characterization, we do look for areas that are nearly without faults to preserve that reservoir. I think I could follow up in a breakout with more specific around that. If Nigel has anything else there, I would pass that on to him as well.
So I would say, so of course, just the existence of faults, you know, isn't necessarily a risk in itself. Those faults can be sealing and not cause any leakage consequences. Of course, fault reactivation is a risk due to pressure and slip of the faults. That can be imposed by pressure and, of course, any geomechanical impact from CO2 actually contacting them. But they may not actually still be reactivated. So it does take, of course, modeling. There is no rule of thumb that I've ever seen really being placed. It depends upon whether the fault moves through your whole storage complex and potentially could be a leakage point, of course, into to underground sources of drinking water above. So it really needs to be considered on a case-by-case basis. There isn't you have to stay away from faults by a certain distance.
Yeah,
Richard.
and I'll say something, Patricia. Yeah, the other thing is that in some areas, like in the service territory in the southeast where we have at Southern Company, we have pretty thick sedimentary rocks over some basement rocks, and those basement rocks may have faults. So the other question, you know, or topic that's of interest is you may not have faults in the formation where you're injecting. You might have good porosity and permeability, but if you do have faults in formations that are further at depth, you know, would preclude you from using those shallower formations.
Thanks, all. That was helpful. And again, we can potentially have the ability to chat with about that topic more in some breakout sessions. But moving on, you know, Jeff talked some about models of shared sequestration, also referred to as hub and clusters. And certainly in Texas, there's going to be opportunities for that to develop as well. Richard, I wanted to get your perspective as, you know, what are some of the considerations of these shared sequestration models from an emitter perspective? You know, when you have a project and you're looking for a storage site, you know, what are some of the pros and cons of shared sequestration versus a single storage site? And Richard, that was for you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. You know, I think that, you know, all things can be worked out contractually, but obviously there's some things there that would cause some angst. You know, if you have multiple sources going to one, you know, central storage hub, and you have some issues with leakage, you know, who's not getting the tax credit? You know, that would be one of the potential liabilities. Or if there is, you know, any leakage that creates, you know, harm to human health and the environment, or, you know, USDW is, you know, be responsible there if you've got multiple sources. So, I mean, I think that could be worked out contractually, but it does give me a little hesitancy. I would, you know, it makes me a little nervous to think that I'd be pooling CO2 with other industrial facilities, you know, in one location.
Nigel or Tony, I wonder if you have any kind of thoughts on that topic as well.
Yeah, I certainly do, and I actually think that the model that will develop is actually of sequestration as a service through hubs. I do agree with Richard on some of the challenges, but when you look at doing this, you really benefit from economies of scale, right? And so if you have an emitter that, let's say, is emitting 500,000, 700,000, 1 million tons, it is much more expensive to sequester that volume of CO2 rather than a hub that is eventually going to sequester 5 million tons of CO2. And so the cost curve is very dramatic in terms of the marginal cost coming down over time. So I actually think that model will evolve throughout the U.S. where you have service companies providing that, and taking, being able to secure the various risks that are inherent in that business.
And we do.
I'm sorry, I think some of that has to do with whether the service providers are willing to take on that long liability and risk. Where do they rely, and who's ultimately responsible for it contractually.
Agreed.
And we do have a question. We might not be able to answer this here, and it may be good for you to kind of attend Tony's session. But he's asking, are we aware of any sequestration sites in Texas right now that are looking to take CO2 from other smaller emitters? Tony, I guess you might have kind of the best idea of other projects that might be willing to take on others' CO2.
Yeah. I don't believe that there are any dedicated sequestration sites where you're doing pure sequestration today. However, the Occidental Petroleum has 20 million tons of CO2 use every year in the Permian Basin. And so we're working on projects to essentially replace the naturally occurring CO2 that we're using today with anthropogenic CO2. And so we consider those sort of bolt-on opportunities. If you're near West Texas, then those are really good opportunities for Oxy to look at and provide that sequestration service through our enhanced oil recovery business.
Thank you.
I think there's definitely some plans, and of course, just next door in Louisiana, Gulf Coast sequestration. Recently applied for their Class 6 permit. I'm sure we'll see some similar activities, given the natural endowment of geology along the Gulf Coast. In Texas as well. I'm sure we'll see some innovative and entrepreneurs also look to do something similar here.
Thank you. And I would say before we move on to the next topic, we're getting into pipelines. As I said, we have a lot of experts, both kind of on as audience members and from the panels. One of our audience members did share that EPA actually allows faults in projects. They need to be shown to be non-transmissive. And Leslie Savage, one of our previous presenters, kind of said that as well. So just a little bit insight from others in the group. But as I said, I'd like to go on to the pipeline issue, that's kind of storage part of the equation. Certainly pipelines are looking to be one of the primary ways that we're going to move CO2 from emitters to potential sequestration sites. But it's not a clear and easy path to get pipelines developed across the United States. So that could certainly be a challenge going forward. So Nigel, you want to give some of your thoughts on, the necessity of pipelines, the challenges of pipelines, maybe from both a Texas and then more of a national perspective, what we might see in terms of pipeline development going forward.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Patricia. So definitely the selection of the mode of transport from a source to sink or market, of course, for utilization, depends upon the volume of CO2 and the distance. There's alternatives to pipelines, such as rail, truck, barge, and ship. I've worked on ship designs, certainly, and also a project that looked to do CO2 movement from trucks. To get over some of course, the issues associated with pipelines. I would say this is a good opportunity to mention the National Petroleum Council CCUS study. A lot of people on the call, worked on that. The transport chapter, the lead author of which was Dan Cole at Denbury Resources, he clarifies really the issues well with quote, there is no expectation that alternative modes of CO2 transport would enable the large volumes of CO2 associated with wide-scale deployment of CCUS. And CO2 transport from rail and truck may be viable for shorter distances within the United States, and transport by ship using tankers can be scaled to meet international CO2 transport needs. But therefore, of course, wide-scale CCUS deployment within the United States really does depend upon CO2 pipelines. And we do have existing infrastructure, of course, 5,000 miles of CO2 pipelines, more than the rest of the world combined. and really looking to expand and extend that existing infrastructure, loop in replacement or other engineering modifications, as well as the construction of new pipelines is pretty key. Several challenges to scaling up transport infrastructure to avoid delays and increased cost. The complexity, I think, of interstate and intrastate pipeline permitting processes is a key issue. They often involve multiple federal, state, and local agencies, as well as the public. And in addition, several factors, of course, can affect the time frame for permitting a project, given different types of those permits or authorizations, delays in the reviews needed by stakeholders, of course, and of course, the project applicants and their incomplete potential applications in the first place. Of course, a solution is some form of eminent domain, being the right of a government or an agent of the government to take and provide just compensation for private property for use for the public stroke benefit. And of course, that could help, but I don't think it's going to necessarily resolve all of the issues that associate with the expansion of infrastructure. So it's not currently, from a federal perspective, CO2 pipelines are not considered to be under the Federal Interstate Commerce Act. Therefore, there's no consistent regulations around rates and services or federal eminent domain authority. Many states, of course, though, have the authority around the siting of pipeline infrastructure under the public benefit approach. And of course, I think that we'll see some, I think, movements along those ways. But upfront construction costs, and of course, as Richard mentioned, and we discussed regarding hubs and cluster type approaches, timing and the commercial contracts of firm supply and offtake contracts are very complicated between multiple different entities. And if you scale up, of course, the costs, the risks start to increase as well. So it's a very complex chain to try to integrate together in that way when there's multiple parties and not one underlying party that's involved in all of the chain. And so really, I think overcoming this issue, and we pointed to this in the NPC study, it requires a system level analysis that can really help to optimize development of the right CO2 infrastructure and help the states. And we really recommended from the NPC study that the DOE create a CO2 pipeline working group made up of relevant federal and state regulatory agencies and interested stakeholders to study the best way to harmonize federal, state, and local permitting processes, establish tariffs, grant access, administer the eminent domain authority, and facilitate pipeline corridor planning.
Thank you. That was really interesting and certainly not going to be necessarily an easy challenge to solve. We will, in the next session, Elizabeth is going to do a really interesting job of kind of pointing out where there are major sources, how pipelines could be developed to address those sources. So we'll come back to pipelines in the next session. We're going to switch gears a little bit to kind of the business case for CCS projects. And obviously that's going to affect project financing. And I'm going to ask Tony to kind of give, some thoughts to this in doing structuring. So obviously we know that we've talked some about the two obvious players here are both the emitter and the storage site in a project. Although I think that there certainly could be other players as well. And, as we see these project financing models come on, we see the project developers potentially taking a large role in these projects. So, Tony, do you want to walk through a little bit about how you see deals being structured around CCS projects so that for people who might be considering projects, it could give them some options of what that could look like? And Tony, that was for you.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. Thanks, Patricia. And like you were saying, there's really sort of three key aspects here. You have the emitter, capture or sequesterer. When you're talking about financing these structures, you're talking about utilizing a tax equity partner at this capture facility. Sometimes this even goes into a fourth aspect where the tax equity partner might not want to finance the pipeline. And so you might actually even have a lateral pipeline that would be financed separately. But in general, it's those three aspects. I would say I think we're at sort of version 1.0 of these project finance structures, utilizing a partnership flip structure for these transactions. And so essentially what you have is you're going to have a tax equity partner that is going to invest an upfront amount of money, and they will take on sort of the equity like risk of this partnership, but they are generally being allocated the vast majority of these tax credits and a smaller portion of the cash flow, whereas the partners, the sponsors of that partnership will be getting the majority of the cash flow. And so then the tax equity partner is going to specify a yield at which they would flip out of that economic structure and into an economic structure where they're not going to be getting as much of the allocations of the income tax credits losses and the cash flow. And generally these are structured with fair market buyouts of that tax equity partner's position in the capture facility. So I think we're on version 1.0. We've iterated on it a bit here with some of these first transactions that are in the market. Some of them are looking at back leverage as well. So I'd probably say that's probably version 1.2. What I can say from a contractual standpoint, and this is for probably the emitters that are interested in doing this, you're going to see sort of three contracts that are very important in this value chain. You're going to see a pre-processing agreement, a post-processing agreement, and a sequestration agreement. And that's what links these pieces together, as we're saying. Within these agreements, what's really important for the emitter to think about, actually. This was mentioned before, but it's your minimum volume threshold for 45Q, right? So the emitter really needs to think about whether they can emit at those volumes, or through diligence, the partnership might not happen because they don't believe that you can emit at those volumes, right? Or you can get into some trouble down the line when you don't emit at those volumes. The second thing that the emitter really needs to think about is not just the minimum volume thresholds for 45Q, but essentially what you're doing here is putting a midstream business on the back of your facility if you're the emitter, right? And so to put a midstream business to work here, that the owner of that partnership, both the tax equity and the sponsor, they're really going to be thinking about minimum volume thresholds that are required to finance that structure to meet the minimum returns. And so this is the main thing that emitters really need to think about is, will I be able to emit at these minimum thresholds over a 12-year period, right? And so really this is where the emitter needs to do the most work. Think about their market, where that might be in 10 years, and commit to something like that, because what's going to happen is if they don't emit those volumes, the structure will require some sort of penalty payment for not emitting those volumes. I think the other thing that the emitter really needs to think about is, I'm decarbonizing my operations or my product. Can I get a CARB LCFS? Is there a pathway for a CARB LCFS credit? So certain fuels qualify for that. I think what else is developing beyond that is probably products that tie in environmental attributes as well. So it might not just have to be a fuel, but there might be a market for products that have a lower carbon intensity. And then I think the other thing from this standpoint, if I was an emitter, what I'd be thinking about is, is there going to be some program in the future, federal or global, otherwise, where there are going to be penalties for emissions, right? And do I want to take advantage of this tax credit now to be able to avoid that type of penalty? And even further, it might not be in the U.S., but other countries are going to be part of possibly things like carbon border taxes, right? And so am I going to limit the products that I can sell internationally if I don't reduce my carbon emissions? And so from the emitter standpoint, really, those are the things that you really need to be focusing on. I would be thinking about a turnkey solution. If I was an emitter, I'm not sure if most emitters want to go into the capture business, want to go into the sequestration business. So I would just recommend picking the right partner for these sorts of things is really important.
Tony, we're actually going over time here. So
perfect. I was going to stop right there.
Cut you off. We're kind of a couple minutes over, but that being said, I do want to give, I want to ask one more kind of question to Richard to kind of tie up. And I think you expressed some of this, but we have seen some questions, and we certainly know this is the case. We know that 45Q isn't the end all be all on making projects profitable, and we've gotten some questions around that. And I've gotten questions about what other money could there be available if you're, I think they mentioned the cement industry and you need to decarbonize. And so, certainly I think everyone here kind of recognizes that 45Q is this great incentive, but certainly is not going to make every project financially make sense. But that's not the only thing that's kind of at play here. So Richard, do you maybe want to kind of speak to some of Southern's perspective on 45Q? And it may not be enough, but we still need to kind of get projects moving and why. And again, in just kind of like a minute or two of your perspective there.
Yeah, the tax credit definitely is a huge incentive, and it goes a long ways to offsetting the costs of capture with next of a kind technology as determined by NRG and boundary dam projects for advanced amine on coal. It gets devalued with gas because although the costs of capture are a little less on gas, you've got such a dilute CO2 concentration in natural gas that it would take much longer to pay off the asset. As a matter of fact, you wouldn't come close to paying it off with 12 years of even mature $50 a ton tax credit. So you would need something else to bridge that gap. And that's probably one of the things that a lot of people are talking about right now is how do you incentivize gas with 45Q as much as the tax credit incentivizes coal, capture on coal right now. And 48A is a possibility, but the problem with 48A with an electrical utility is we have to normalize our tax credits over the life of the asset. And if you normalize the tax credit, you derate it about 56%. So you really end up with much less money on the dollar for the tax credit if you have to normalize that tax credit. That is one good thing about 45Q is that you would get it yearly and you don't have to normalize it. It's not an investment tax credit, it's a production tax credit. So, I mean, again, I don't want to, 45Q is wonderful. And I think it's got a lot of people looking at, in the utility sector, looking at capturing, from coal and gas, but it doesn't quite go far enough. And then the last thing I'll say, Patricia, is that the commence construction date is a deal killer for so many people. I mean, right now, the January 1st, 2024 is not enough time for utilities to wrap their arms around the tax credit and understand it enough and have enough experience with claiming it, transferring it, valuing it to where it really needs to be extended 5 to 10 years for it to have full impact in the utility industry.
Well, again, thank you so much. I think we could go on with these panelists for an hour longer and still have things to talk about. But the show must go on to kind of the next panel. So Richard, Nigel, Tony, I really appreciate your participation and your leadership in this space generally. Tony will be back from Oxy for this breakout session tomorrow. And again, that session is meant to be interactive for you to turn on your mics and your video cameras and ask some questions directly of Tony and potentially other experts in the room. So hopefully you will come back to that session and we can continue talking about how to get these projects going. But thank you again, and we'll move on to the next panel. It's our final panel of the afternoon. And that's on the Permian Basin environment. So we'll have two panelists joining me here. Elizabeth Abramson, who's with the Great Plains Institute. She's a research analyst and has done what I think is some really interesting work on kind of what are the CO2 emission sources that 45Q would make sense for, that CCS makes sense for in Texas, what might be some of those pipeline corridors we'd want to build, and what could this kind of new industry of CO2 management look like. And then we're going to get back deep into some of the geology of Texas, and you know, they can continue to give evidence to their claim that Texas is the best place to kind of bury CO2 in the whole wide world. So I will pass this off to Elizabeth, and they will be taking questions at the end. So keep your questions coming. Thanks.
Thanks, Patricia. Am I on mute? Can you hear me?
No, we can hear you.
Oh, perfect. I got a little notification, but if things are good, thanks for the introduction. I definitely can't take credit for all of this work, but in these next few slides, I'll be giving an overview of the work that the Great Plains Institute has done to model what potential for regional carbon capture, transport, and storage looks like in the US, and then honing in specifically on implications for CCS in Texas and the Permian Basin. And why don't we go ahead into the slides? And we can skip ahead on this one. Great. So over a collaborative 2-year process, the Great Plains Institute has worked on modeling opportunities for the build-out of an optimized regional carbon capture, transport, and storage network. And this involved identifying facilities that appear to be good, feasible near or medium-term candidates for capture retrofit, identifying areas for potential storage of captured CO2, and then finally modeling an optimized infrastructure network to connect those near and medium-term candidates for capture with potential carbon sinks in a way that would maximize the carbon that's stored while minimizing associated costs and land use impacts. To do that, we worked with a wide variety of institutional partners, including Los Alamos National Lab, Indiana Geological and Water Survey, and Stanford University. And additionally, we relied on collaboration with participants of the Regional Carbon Capture Deployment Initiative, which is facilitated through the Great Plains Institute. Participants of that initiative represent a wide variety of industrial sectors, NGOs, state government and policymaking bodies, national labs, and university research teams in roughly 25 member states. Next slide. Details of the facility screening process and the modeling approach for our analysis that I'm going to be talking about can be found also in our analytical white paper, which was published earlier this summer. You can also find state-specific resources on carbon capture opportunities and associated jobs and economic benefit on our website, carboncaptureready.org. Next slide, please. With our partners at Stanford, we conducted a review of major emitting facilities across the US and screened them for expected Section 45Q eligibility and potential to support a retrofit with carbon capture equipment in the near or medium term. So all stationary emitting facilities that report to the EPA's greenhouse gas reporting program are represented on this map you see here. Dark teal dots represent facilities that would be expected to qualify for the Section 45Q tax credit by meeting those 100,000 and 500,000 ton per year minimum emissions thresholds for industrial and power facilities respectively, which we heard a lot about earlier. And then those bright purple dots you see represent facilities that our screening process identified as having potential to support carbon capture retrofit in the near to medium term. You can see those are contained mostly within those states shaded in slightly darker gray, which was the focus of our study. That was our study region. And by the near to medium term, we're talking mainly about the next 15 or so years. Our screening process to identify those facilities assessed operational patterns and expected lifetime of each facility, and we estimated capture targets by right-sizing equipment at the unit level within each facility. Next slide. We worked with Advanced Resources International to identify oil fields with potential demand for CO2, and we worked with the USGS and state geological surveys to gather data on saline storage. Next slide. Our analysis identified facilities from a wide variety of industries as likely candidates for near or medium-term capture retrofit. And this graph and table here show that many facilities in mid-tier industries have reasonable capture costs when applying unit-level facility screening and right-sizing of equipment. Generally, the high purity and low concentration, back on that same slide, please. Generally, the high purity and concentration of CO2 emissions in industries like ethanol, ammonia, and gas processing result in the lowest estimated capture costs on a per ton basis, as you can see clustered on the lower left of that graph. Next slide, thanks. So after completing our facility screening process and gathering data on carbon storage sites, we conducted a series of scenario modeling efforts to identify an optimized regional CO2 transport infrastructure network that would connect those sources and sinks using the Los Alamos SIM-CCS model. The SIM-CCS model identifies a transport network that maximizes the amount of carbon stored while minimizing infrastructure investment and land use impact, as I mentioned earlier. And part of how the model does that is by avoiding over a dozen specific land use types, such as bodies of water, areas with high population density, protected resources and federal lands, as well as tribal and sovereign territories. Using this model, we conducted 3 primary scenario variations, with the baseline scenario you see on this map showing a vision of regional infrastructure that could become feasible with some additional policy and financing support in the near to medium term. Each of those colored dots represents a near or medium-term candidate for capture, colored by industry. Black triangles on the map represent existing petroleum basins with potential CO2 demand, and blue triangles represent potential non-specific saline injection areas. And then running between those sinks and sources, you can see the optimized infrastructure network that the SIM-CCS model produced. Our modeling identified multiple high-capacity trunk segments, which aggregate CO2 from sources throughout the study region for transport to Texas, the Permian Basin, and the Gulf Coast area, and then with smaller feeder lines connecting individual sources to those larger trunk lines. This scenario you see here would result in the capture and permanent storage of nearly 300 million tons of CO2 per year. We can move on to the next slide. Thanks. In our near to medium term scenarios, this same scenario, we can see those low cost, high concentration CO2 sources in the upper Midwest that have limited local storage opportunities, aggregating captured CO2 in large common carrier segments for transport to storage and utilization sites down in the Permian. And we can also see multi-use corridors running through the mid-continent states like Kansas and Oklahoma, delivering some CO2 to local storage sites, but also carrying out that long-distance transport to the Permian. Meanwhile, CO2 from the Rockies and the Northern Plains tends to stay above the border of New Mexico, and CO2 from the Eastern Midwest tends to flow to the Texas and Louisiana Gulf in this particular model run. Next slide. The transport networks that our modeling produced included a combination of small feeder lines connecting to individual capture sites and higher capacity trunk lines that aggregated CO2 from those smaller feeder lines into the larger central corridors. And our analysis found that large trunk lines, which you can see here in green, achieve the best economies of scale and lowest per ton transport cost, while smaller feeder lines connecting individual facilities to the larger network have a higher per ton transport cost. Next slide. Using the NETL CO2 transport cost model to calculate investment requirements, we found clear economies of scale with that higher capacity shared infrastructure. Many of the costs involved in construction are not actually related to materials, but rather land use right-of-way, engineering, and labor. And those non-material costs and the land used for construction don't necessarily grow with higher capacity transport segments. Total costs of infrastructure actually decline on a per inch mile basis with increased capacity, as shown in the graph on the left. And because the resulting transport tariff that users of the network must pay is based on those infrastructure costs, the transport tariffs also decline on a dollar per ton basis with the higher capacity shared infrastructure. And you can see that trend line on the graph on the right. Next slide. Zooming into a sample of the infrastructure network from one of our modeling scenarios, we can see a mix of CO2 delivery capacities depicted with the varying thickness of each line, and we can see the estimated transport tariffs labeled on each segment. Small feeder lines, like the one circled in the upper right, have a higher effective transport tariff, while mid-size and major trunk segments have transport tariffs that are well under $10. A typical user of the pipeline network would have to pay some combination or average of the tariffs along the route between a capture source and a storage location. Because most users will deliver CO2 through a combination of the smaller feeder lines and the larger trunk lines, every user would benefit from the lower effective cost per ton along those larger shared common carrier segments. Next slide. In our near to medium term scenario, we see around 38 million tons of CO2 flowing into Texas toward the Permian Basin through larger trunk lines, with additional aggregation and delivery from sources within Texas. Next slide. Now, our facility screening and modeling process identified a large number of near and medium term opportunities for capture and transport, but the main finding of our study was that in order to gain the maximum benefit from carbon capture and infrastructure planning, it's important to plan beyond the near or medium term. Our study found that planning carbon capture and transport infrastructure to meet mid-century levels of carbon capture deployment, so aiming more towards 2050 levels, leads to greater returns on capital investment than solely near-term planning would. And that resulted in a doubling of the amount of carbon captured and stored, while only marginally increasing costs and land use impacts. Developing policy solutions and region-wide coordination in the near term to support those mid-century levels of carbon capture deployment will allow us to take advantage of those environmental benefits and the economies of scale that we're seeing, and which we wouldn't likely capture by planning out only a network with near-term projects in mind. Next slide. So the focus of our study was on carbon capture and transport at the broader regional scale, but since we do have state-specific data, I'll give a brief overview of what we found in Texas. In Texas, we see 331 million metric tons of CO2 that could be captured from 167 Section 45Q eligible facilities that we identified. And that means that over 80% of stationary emissions from industrial and power facilities in Texas would be eligible for capture with the Section 45Q tax credit. Next slide. Then of that larger total, our analysis identified 87 million metric tons that could be captured from 94 facilities with near to medium term potential to support carbon capture retrofit in Texas. If we look at the rightmost column on this table, we can see that 74% of all emissions from Texas cement plant were identified as being feasible for near-term capture in our analysis. And we also see a large portion of emissions from the hydrogen, refining, ethanol, and power sectors identified as feasible for near-term capture. Next slide. And this slide again focuses on those near and medium term candidates for capture that our study identified. And you can see capture potential summarized by industry in 3 broad geographic subregions. The totals reported for the Permian Basin here refer to facilities both in Texas and a few in New Mexico. And the Permian has potential to capture 7.8 million metric tons of CO2 per year from near to medium term candidate facilities, and again has potential to store CO2 from many more sources of near and medium term candidates in Central Texas and the Gulf. Next slide. This map distinguishes between existing oil fields that could begin to purchase CO2 with oil prices at $40 per barrel, which are shown in lighter green triangles, and then oil fields that could begin to purchase CO2 with oil prices at $60 per barrel, and those are the darker green triangles there. And if we assume the more conservative $40 per barrel oil price, we could expect an estimated 94 million metric tons of CO2 demand per year in Texas and Permian Basin EOR operations alone, with 27.5 million metric tons of CO2 demand per year just in the greater Permian area. Next slide. Our modeling finds that it would be economically feasible to capture 98 million tons of CO2 from the Midwest for transport to the Permian. And though our modeling showed a preference for connecting sources in the Rockies to storage sites that were also within the Rockies, with development of additional CO2 transport infrastructure, there would be potential to supply 63 million metric tons of captured carbon per year from the Rockies to the Permian. And additionally, our modeling showed 87 million tons of CO2 that could be feasibly captured by Texas sources in the near to medium term, which could then be stored locally in Texas and the Permian as well. So assuming an estimated 27.5 million tons of CO2 demand per year in the Permian Basin, demand for CO2 in the Permian could then easily be saturated by sources flowing in from outside of Texas. In order to capture the maximum economic benefit and jobs benefits from carbon capture, Texas could prioritize developing CCS projects at facilities within the state first, while also developing transport infrastructure to connect to transport corridors that are flowing in from out of state. Next slide. Okay, and again, you can find more information about the economic benefits of carbon capture in Texas specifically on our website, carboncaptureready.org, where we have a new set of state fact sheets recently rolled out detailing impacts of carbon capture for the economy and jobs. And you can also find a growing number of other state-specific resources on the site and more information about our analytical work there. So with that, I will turn things back over to Patricia. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And we'll save some questions for you. We'll get through tip slides, and then certainly we'll open up questions to both of our panelists here. So I will let Tip share more about the CCUS kind of geology in the Gulf of Mexico. Thanks, Tip.
Yeah, thanks, Patricia, and thanks for everybody for hanging in there on a long Zoom here. Glad you're here to hear about some of these opportunities, because there's never been a more vigorous time in CCS in the 15 years I've been working on this. So excited to share with you some ideas. I'm not going to talk about the Permian Basin. I think at least from a supply-demand perspective, that Elizabeth's presentation covered it really well. So those of you that know me know I focus on the Gulf Coast and the Gulf of Mexico, so that's what I'm going to talk about. So if you move to the next slide, you'll see that most of what I'm interested in conveying to you has to do with the maturity of our understanding of CCS, and at least in the Gulf Coast. There are really quite a few projects that have been done, both research and demonstration, as well as industrial scale projects. I won't even have time to cover all of them. Apologies if I can't get your project in, but it's exciting. And then there's an existing capture and pipeline transport infrastructure that's really evolving and connecting hubs. And we see a lot of the things happening that I think need to happen for large scale sequestration. There has been a lot of work done to mature the near offshore storage in our Miocene geology, and that's really what I've spent a lot of my time on, say, the past 8 or 9 years. So I'll summarize a little bit of that, and then show you where you can find more information on it if you're interested. And then I'll just give you a quick, if I don't have a slide on it, I'll mention that the 2 active projects we're involved with relate to some carbon safe type activity. We weren't funded in phase 2, but we're going to be going back again for phase 3. And we're currently working with DOE on the DOMCARB partnership in the Western Gulf of Mexico to assess regional capacity for storage. So next slide. One of the things that I think is important to remember is that you don't want to do CCS far from your CCS or from your emissions sources. So the inset map there in the upper left is the United States, just sort of a center of mass heat map of all those EPA sources that Elizabeth was talking about. And the inset map shows the Ohio River Valley and Mississippi Valley as being pretty intense. But the other big center of emissions is here on the sort of northwestern Gulf of Mexico. So you see the intensity around the Mississippi River corridor, and then westward over through Lake Charles and into Port Arthur and Beaumont and the Houston Ship Channel area and La Porte, where some demo plants are, and then also down into Texas City. And even all the way down into the Corpus Christi area where we see a lot of new activity. So these are kind of where we think of the big, massive opportunities are for aggregating sources and feeding into these pipeline networks. Next slide, please. The Carbon Center that I've worked at for 15 years has been involved with about 6 projects over the years. We had the very first sort of high-profile saline formation test in the Frio Formation, Oligocene age in Liberty County, east of Houston, and those tests were in 2004 and 2006. And then we proceeded to work with DOE funding at a CO2 EOR field in Cranfield, Mississippi, indicated by number 2 there in Southwest Mississippi. And then you're probably aware of the Air Products and Hastings project. Our group is involved with the MMV at the Hastings site, or the monitoring there. That's an EOR and storage project. And we've also, it's not, oh yeah, so number 4 there is the NRG to West Ranch EOR and CCS project. You probably saw the news recently that they've stopped injecting there. I don't think it's as grim as everybody says. There's actually a lot of interest in redirecting that into saline now. And then in the offshore, we've had a lot of activity. We've had work with the BOEM in the federal offshore for a best practices manual. And we've had a number of projects over the past decade that focused on different aspects of characterization in the area. So what Elizabeth was talking about was sort of the Permian Basin network over in the western Texas, and this is more of a focus on the Gulf Coast areas. So next slide, please. We do leverage the fact that there is an immense amount of data available in the Gulf Coast and Gulf of Mexico. It's one of the most explored basins in the world. It has a lot of existing wells, which can be seen as an advantage for characterization and as a liability for potentially for storing. But we have a lot of information. We are going into this at a stage when we are actually able to quantify and characterize at scales that we think gigaton CCS matters for. And so that's really important. So this is just two graphics to show that the amount of well data that exists and also some of the seismic data that's out there. We have a partner research group at our Institute for Geophysics next door that is the Gulf Basin Depositional Synthesis. It's an industrial associates program, and for probably 2 decades, they've been the leaders in characterizing the Gulf of Mexico. So we partner with them in our ability to work with data. So next slide, I'll just highlight some of the data sets that we've been able to work with in the inner shelf zone. We don't necessarily feel like we'll be jumping straight out to the mid or outer shelf to begin with, although there may be a few opportunities there. So you see here some 3D seismic data sets we've been able to work with at quite regional scale, and then a lot of integrated 2D lines. There's been some other publicly available surveys that have become available that we've integrated. So at this stage, we probably have continuous interpretation of different stratigraphic horizons tied to biostratigraphy for safely thousands of square miles in this area. So the area, one of the areas we've been particularly focused on is very southeast Texas in the Jefferson County. And the data set there extends over into the Louisiana state waters as well as southwestern Cameron Parish, where there's a lot of interest. So next slide, please. With a lot of that really dense geologic data, we first set out just to do some regional capacity mapping, static capacity that you might be familiar with. This result generally tracks what we understand the overall Miocene geology to be. We have a couple of deltaic systems that tend to create large net sand intervals. One is on the upper coast there in the red, and then another in sort of the mid-coast area. These are not artifacts of the data, but are actually representative of large long-term deltaic complex developments. So thousands of feet of stratigraphy with really high net sand values. So that was our first effort to kind of just show people what the potential might be. In the next slide, you'll see that same kind of color scheme, but overlaid with the infrastructure and the other types of things that matter for CCS. So the green line is dedicated CO2 pipelines, and there are 2 main network lines there. One is from the NRG plant to West Ranch, and the rest is the Denver line, the green line coming over from Louisiana. And the blue symbols there are all those sources that we were talking about before. So you can see the clusters in interesting areas. And then the blue pipeline is actually bringing in heavy crude from other areas for refining in these centers. And I bring that up because it requires increasing amount of hydrogen to break up those heavy hydrocarbon molecules. So typically we're doing that with steam methane reforming of methane, and that generates a lot of CO2. So we see a lot of interest in developing CCS projects in the context of hydrogen projects, and also very much so in the context of liquefied natural gas terminals, where there's additional methane cleanup as well as compression emissions. So we felt like this is the region that has a lot of very high potential for amalgamation and hub development. And so we've been looking at the near offshore there. The next graphic just kind of gives you, if you haven't been thinking about offshore, you know, the graphic here presents just an overall sense of, you know, what might be involved. You're going to be doing some things onshore. You might have some sort of buffer storage facility at the coastline, and you may be piping it offshore to some prior or newly developed offshore facility for injection. So a lot of components that come into play. I didn't mention it, but one of the reasons that we're interested in the offshore is that it presents very large contiguous areas to work with a single landowner. And that was a topic that came up in earlier discussion in this workshop. And Leslie mentioned the September 15th date as one where the General Land Office that manages the Texas offshore received approval from the School Land Board to lease offshore tracts in Jefferson County, Texas State Waters for project development. So they're developing an RFP process for leasing of those lands for project development, and the timeline is looking like it might be released sometime in the first quarter of next year. Next slide, please. The geology is somewhat complex. We heard some discussion on faults a little bit earlier. From my perspective as a structural geologist, faults shouldn't necessarily be something to be afraid of. In fact, many of our largest natural gas accumulations, the natural systems have set up on these faults. So here I'm just showing a typical cross section through the state waters from onshore to offshore, left to right. And we often see these salt features that create fault networks above them. And those have very typically served as excellent traps for hydrocarbon reservoirs. So the type log over on the right side just shows that very thick net sand interval that develops in the Miocene section, and the overlying transgressive marine shales that serve as regional seal for a lot of the hydrocarbon depleted hydrocarbon fields. So we can learn a lot actually from those fields, and that's one of the things I spend a lot of time with, thinking about what our capacities might be for these projects. The next slide just shows a little bit of detail. If you took a specific location and started to work up what you might have as potential for a site, you can see that we very often, as I mentioned, there's hydrocarbon accumulation in some of these fault settings, and we always tend to see them occurring in conjunction with the structure and the overlying top seal of the Amphibious Shale. So we've done extensive seismic mapping on this. We've used historical production data to quantify volumes of buoyant fluid that might be retained, and we can work up capacities for these sites. In general, we tend to see that individual sand bodies are probably on the say 5 to 10 megaton capacity scale, and when you start to stack those together, you can pretty quickly get into the 100 megaton scale for a site, depending on how you go about developing it. The next slide just presents a publication that we summarized probably close to a decade of work in a number of chapters that you see there on the right for the state waters. So it's quite mature in terms of its development. We've evaluated sort of the petroleum systems. We've looked at the confining units. We've addressed all kinds of actual capacity estimates for fields. So if you're interested in learning more, this is a primary resource. It's available online at a very modest cost, both digitally and in paper. But it probably has the kind of information you're interested in for understanding what geologic aspects might come into play for storage. So I think that's really all I wanted to convey to you. The idea is that the state waters will be open for business, at least part of them, starting early next year. And we are already seeing a lot of interest in understanding what that process will be like. And we've also seen a lot of industry interest in trying to develop projects. And lastly, I would just say that one of the things that we're excited about is the ability to start this process with the state, where we have a lot of assurance on what the lease regime will be and the land ownership issues, and then potentially expanding out into the Gulf of Mexico, which in my opinion is kind of an end game solution for national emissions in the United States. So thanks very much. I have my sponsors to thank at the Carbon Center, both the Department of Energy and then a lot of our data vendors that we've worked with. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Tip, for that great presentation. So we do have some questions that flowed through, and I will ask those. We're just going to go for probably another 8 minutes or so, if you want to kind of hold on, but thank you everyone for sticking with us. So first, Elizabeth, I got an excellent presentation comment from one of our audience members, and they asked specifically, does the 16 cement plants in Texas include quicklime facilities? That's a similar manufacturing process because you only saw 10. So a little bit, I think we've seen a couple kind of questions from the cement industry throughout the day. So happy to see that they're engaged.
I believe it does, but don't quote me on it. I actually didn't do that segment of facility screening, so I would have to get back to you.
Okay, so we'll look to kind of maybe give an answer offline. And another question, what formula was used to calculate the dollar per ton CO2 transportation costs? And just if there were any, if you had any information about inputs, time frame, discount rate, et cetera, and we could certainly take that offline as well.
Yeah, well, we run everything through the NETL CO2 transport cost model, and the formulas are much too complex for me to relay. But generally, we're looking at like diameter and flow distance and basic things like that you feed in, and then it works its magic and spits out some numbers.
Okay, great. I think this is kind of a repeat question. I think I saw it earlier, but we'll kind of get to it now. And I think it's probably more directed towards Tip. Can we get a rule of thumb for how to think about CO2 storage capacity? It obviously depends on reservoir conditions, but for example, what range of CO2 storage capacity would you expect for 100 MMBO field?
Okay, so I guess I've been mostly thinking about it in gas volumes and not oil volumes, but if I do think it's useful to think about these projects in terms of units that most operators and industry reps are used to thinking in. Like I often say that we're probably looking for the hundreds of BCF into TCF scale fields for economic CCS development. I could find you plenty of places to dab CO2 in at the 10 or 50 BCF level, but it's not really going to be economic to do it that way, at least initially. You might step out and develop some projects like that, but right now what we're seeing is we're kind of looking for these places where we might get up into the 500 BCF into the TCF range for storage. And in terms of millions of barrels of oil, hopefully there's I can't do that conversion in my head real quick, but most of our oil and gas or oil fields in the state waters were also rather small, and we are interested in understanding whether that is a finite limitation of the geology or whether that was a result of the charge history. I tend to think it's the latter, but it is true that most of the fields are underfilled with respect to their structural closure, and that is something that we think is worth investigating more. That specific example I gave you was a good one where it looks like some of the one of the biggest concerns we have right now on the geology side is actually too much sand adjacent to each other on faults. So we're trying to avoid sand on sand juxtapositions over large thicknesses, and we're looking for actually not necessarily the thickest net sand interval, but the most isolated large sand body we can find.
We have a couple questions here on, some offshore versus onshore. The first is, could you explain what's the vision for monitoring system plume movement and pressure in offshore CCS hub?
Yes, so sure. This is actually a topic I have a lot of direct experience with. I've been working with a high resolution 3D seismic system for about 8 years now, and it actually looks like it's going to be the perfect tool for doing the overburden characterization, that is looking at the geology above the injection interval. This is not something that your oil and gas exploration group is typically thinking about, but it's something that the CCS community is much more attuned to. They want to know what's above their injection interval, and this is a tool that can actually image that in much higher resolution than conventional seismic. So I would say that the offshore monitoring strategy will primarily be one of downhole or other pressure measurements, together with some seismic imaging. We know 4D seismic can be very successful in the right depth range with the right rock rheologies, if that's not too obtuse to say, but Sleipner is like the poster child for 4D seismic, and some of our Miocene sands are very, very similar. So we're optimistic that this is a big business for seismic vendors and seismic acquisition companies, and there are such great new technologies for that I think we're going to see a whole new generation of seismic data come forward to speak to these issues. But I think there was another question related to onshore versus offshore. My very simple pitch on that is we have direct experience with companies who have tried to develop projects onshore, and the two issues they run into are the two we're talking about in this session: transport and land acquisition. And if they can't get their hands around both those two issues, they start to look to where that's a simpler deployment case. And in the land acquisition case, you're dealing with a single landowner and mineral owner, and that eliminates all unitization efforts or any other kind of amalgamation efforts. Otherwise, you're left with the largest landowners onshore, and there are some interesting ones like timber companies that could be engaged. But yeah, offshore presents those advantages, and then the second main advantage is that EPA's Class 6 well permitting is primarily there to protect against potential impact on protected groundwater. When you move into the offshore setting, A, the groundwater doesn't generally exist, and if it does, B, it's probably on the list for potential use. So it's not that we don't consider it unimportant, it's just that it really reduces the anxiety over that extremely. So we think that's a big advantage as well. And there's no NUMBY, right? You're out there.
Well, thanks. We certainly have more questions we can ask, but I want to be true to everyone's time and kind of wrap up this session. We'll bring Jeff Erickson kind of on to do a little bit of the wrap up for the day, but while we're kind of switching over, just to highlight, we do have sessions tomorrow. That was a separate registration, so it's a separate meeting ID. So if you didn't register for tomorrow, you can certainly still do that. It's under our website, the event lists, day 1 and day 2. So certainly feel free to join us again. We hope you'll join us again tomorrow if you can. And then, within tomorrow's sessions, as I said, we're going to have these breakout sessions that will allow, if you didn't get your questions answered today, certainly you can go back to some of our experts in the sessions tomorrow, as well as Ken Medlock, who's in the panel session tomorrow, will be talking some also about Texas specifically, because I know there were some questions on kind of Texas liability, maybe some more on pore space, mineral rights, and Ken can address that as well, in our panel session tomorrow and that breakout session. But thank you so much, Tip and Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all.
And we were going to have Jeff Erickson come on. There you go.
Hey,
And Jeff will do kind of a wrap up of day one.
Yeah, very quickly, just a couple of thoughts. First of all, thanks to the great speakers and presenters that we had today. When we were asked by USEA and DOE to put this set of workshops together, the objective of the workshops was to actually advance the ball on CCS project development and do it in particular regions. So we focused on first generating interest, second generating knowledge, and third generating relationships. It's more difficult to do online than if we were in person. But we're hoping that some of what you heard today does both generate interest and knowledge, and we'll do everything that we can to generate or build some of those relationships. Sonia, if you wouldn't mind putting up the slide from Keith's presentation. There's one slide he gave that he kind of blew past and didn't discuss it. Yeah, that was the right one. Didn't discuss it in particular, that I just want to bring back, and you may want to take a screenshot of this, because this lists some, though not all, of the business relationships that are essential to put together a project. So you may have some or all of these available in your own organization. It's likely that you don't have all of them. And I think this is really relevant just to think about, how to pull together a project team on a very complex project. So if you just leave that up there for a minute, Sonia. And like I said, you can actually take a screenshot there at the top of the page if you want. We did focus on practicalities. We're going to focus more on practicalities tomorrow. One of the things that I heard from just about every one of the speakers was a really strong case for investing in CCS in Texas, right? And it started out with Leslie talking about the regulatory environment there. I guess, some of the things that the state of Texas is doing to encourage CCS, but it didn't stop there, and it went through, talking about the experience, the pipelines that are at least in planning stage, if not in construction yet. Certainly the geology is useful as well, and then you've got both the sources and the sinks that are available. So my big takeaway was, I'm not ready to plunk down a couple $100 million to invest in a project, but those of you who are, let us know and we'll hook you up. Tomorrow is going to be focused, like Patricia said, more on practicalities. We're doing some case studies. We'll talk about challenges and strategies to address them. And then we're going to have an open forum. So we're going to give you guys the opportunity to speak with each other, crosstalk, speak back and forth with the presenters directly without very many barriers. I'll say in closing, the last thing I took away from today is that conditions are not static, right? They're continuing to evolve. Regulations are continuing to evolve. Incentives are evolving. Technology is evolving. Pipeline development is evolving. And societal expectations are evolving. In fact, probably the only thing that's not evolving or changing and that remains stable in the CCS world is the geology, is where we put the CO2. So looking forward to some great conversations tomorrow. If you have any questions between now and then, certainly feel free to get in touch with either Patricia or myself, and we'll get you squared away. Thanks everybody for hanging in there today, and looking forward to seeing you again on the call tomorrow. Patricia, back to you.
That's it. Everyone have a good night, and we'll see you again tomorrow. Thanks.